The Appalachian Trail stretches 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine. Every year, thousands of hikers walk its paths seeking adventure, peace, and a connection with nature. But for some, the trail becomes their final destination. This is the story of 21 mysteries that haunt America's most famous hiking trail. Missing persons who vanished without a trace, brutal murders that shocked the hiking community, families who never stopped searching, and predators who turned a peaceful wilderness into their hunting ground. Some cases have been solved, others remain open cold cases decades later. All of them remind us that, even in our most beautiful places, darkness can be waiting just off the beaten path. The vanishing at Spencefield. A bright red shirt disappears into the ancient mountains, and with it a 6-year-old boy who would become one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The forest swallows children's laughter whole sometimes, leaving behind only questions that echo through 5 decades of searching. At 4:30 in the afternoon on June 14, 1969, Dennis Lloyd Martin vanished at Spencefield in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. One moment he was crouched behind a bush with his older brother, planning to surprise the adults walking down the trail. The next, he was gone. His brother emerged from their hiding spot to join the playful ambush they had planned with other children from a nearby camping family. Dennis never came out. His father, William, waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When all the other children had returned to their campsite and Dennis remained missing, William Martin began calling his son's name. The calls echoed across the high meadow of Spencefield, but no small voice answered back. Dennis Lloyd Martin had been born almost 7 years earlier to a family that treasured their time in these mountains. He was a bright boy with mild learning disabilities who loved the outdoors and camping trips with his father and grandfather. The Martin family had been making these Father's Day weekend pilgrimages to the Smokies for years. It was their tradition, their way of connecting across generations in the wilderness that straddled the Tennessee-North Carolina border. This particular weekend, they had hiked into the Spencefield area along the Appalachian Trail. They had spent Friday night at a shelter cabin on the west end of the field, sharing the high country with another family who had children close to Dennis's age. The morning of June 14th dawned clear and promising. The families broke camp and prepared for their hike out. But children will be children, even in the wilderness. Dennis and his brother Douglas had struck up friendships with the other family's children during their overnight stay. As the adults packed gear and prepared to head down the trail, the children devised their plan for a surprise. They would hide in the rhododendron bushes that grew thick around Spencefield and jump out to startle the grown-ups as they walked past. The plan was simple enough. The children scattered to their hiding places while the adults shouldered their packs and started down the trail. Dennis crouched behind a bush near the trail, his red shirt bright against the green foliage. His brother found his own hiding spot nearby. Other children positioned themselves at various points where they could spring their surprise. At 4:30 p.m, the adults came walking down the trail right into the children's carefully planned ambush. Young voices shouted. Children jumped from behind trees and bushes, giggling at their successful prank. But when William Martin looked around for his younger son, Dennis was nowhere to be seen. "Dennis!" William called. The laughter died away. "Dennis, where are you?" The other children looked confused. They had seen Dennis hiding behind his bush just moments before. His older brother Douglas said Dennis had been right there, crouched down and ready to jump out with the rest of them. But now his hiding spot was empty. William Martin ran to the bush where Dennis had been hiding. The ground around it was soft from recent rains. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no clear footprints leading away. The thick rhododendron and mountain laurel formed a green maze around Spencefield, with countless paths a small boy might take. For nearly 2 hours, William searched the immediate area. He called Dennis's name until his voice grew hoarse. He followed every game trail and deer path he could find. He looked behind rocks and fallen logs, anywhere a 6-year-old might hide or take shelter. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the high meadow, William realized he needed help. The Martin family had been camping in these mountains for years. William knew how easy it was to get turned around in the dense forest, how quickly a wrong turn could lead someone deep into wilderness that stretched for hundreds of thousands of acres. He also knew that a 6-year-old boy in a red shirt would not survive long alone in these mountains if night fell and temperatures dropped. By evening, word had reached the National Park Service rangers. By morning, what would become the largest search and rescue operation in national park history was mobilizing. Over the next several days, the number of searchers would swell to more than 1,400 people, including Boy Scouts, National Guard members, FBI agents, and even a unit of 71 Green Berets who had been training nearby. But on that first evening, as darkness settled over Spence Field, Dennis Martin had been missing for only a few hours. His bright red shirt should have made him easy to spot from a distance. His voice should have carried across the mountain meadows when searchers called his name. The rain that began falling that night should have driven him to seek shelter somewhere rescuers could find him. Instead, Dennis Lloyd Martin had simply vanished. The mountains had claimed him as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his family and the search teams for decades to come. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, a 6-year-old boy in a bright red shirt had taken a step away from his hiding place behind a rhododendron bush and walked into one of America's most enduring mysteries. The search would continue for months. Theories would emerge and be discarded. False leads would raise hopes and dash them again. But Dennis Martin would never be found, and the mystery of what happened in those few minutes at Spence Field would become a story that people still tell today, more than 50 years later. Trail names and false identities. The mountains don't keep secrets well, but they kept this one. Within hours of Dennis Martin's disappearance, a web of human connections began forming across the Smokies that would grow into something unprecedented in national park history. Strangers became searchers, families became fixtures in base camps, and everyone involved carried a piece of Dennis's story home with them. William Martin was not the kind of man who panicked easily. As an architect from Knoxville, he approached problems with methodical thinking. But as darkness fell on June 14, 1969, and his 6-year-old son remained missing, that careful composure began to crack. He had searched for nearly 2 hours before admitting he needed help. Now, as park rangers took control of the search, William found himself in the peculiar position of being both the most important person on the mountain and the most helpless. The initial response came from Ranger Billy Ontko, who reached Spence Field around 7:30 that evening. Within hours, the operation began expanding in ways no one had anticipated. Park Superintendent Jack Burrows made the decision to request help from every available source. By morning, what started as a family's worst nightmare had become a full-scale mobilization. The search grid that morning included volunteers from local communities who had driven through the night to help. Boy Scout troops from Tennessee and North Carolina arrived with their leaders, ready to comb through rhododendron thickets and creek beds. Local rescue squads brought their expertise in mountain terrain. The Tennessee Air National Guard sent helicopters to scan from above. But it was the arrival of the Green Berets that marked this search as something extraordinary. Company A, 7th Special Forces Group, had been conducting training exercises at Camp Dawson in West Virginia when word came that their services were needed. 71 elite soldiers, men trained in survival and reconnaissance, loaded into helicopters and flew south to join a search for one small boy. Master Sergeant Francis Kalfas led the Special Forces team that would spend days moving through terrain that challenged even their advanced training. These were soldiers who could navigate enemy territory, survive in hostile environments, and execute precision operations. Yet the Great Smoky Mountains presented them with a puzzle that military training couldn't solve. How do you find a 6-year-old boy who might be hiding from the very people trying to save him? The psychological profile of lost children was something the searchers learned on the job. Dennis had mild developmental delays that might affect how he responded to being lost. Would he seek shelter or keep moving? Would he come when strangers called his name or hide deeper in the brush? Child behavior specialists were consulted, but in 1969 the science of lost child psychology was still developing. Douglas Martin, Dennis's older brother, became a key witness whose testimony shaped the entire search strategy. At 9 years old, Douglas carried the weight of being the last person to see his brother alive. He described how Dennis had been excited about their prank, how he'd crouched behind the rhododendron bush, with his red shirt bright against the green leaves. Douglas walked searchers through the plan they had made, showed them exactly where Dennis had been hiding, and tried to remember every detail that might help find his little brother. The other family that had camped with the Martins found themselves pulled into the investigation in ways they never expected. Their children had been part of the hiding game, and each child was interviewed multiple times about what they had seen and heard. The adults had to retrace their movements, describe the timing of events, and help investigators understand the exact sequence that had led to Dennis's disappearance. Harold Key became one of the most important witnesses, though his testimony would raise more questions than answers. Key, a 45-year-old highway engineer from Carthage, Tennessee, was camping with his family near Rowan's Creek when he heard something that would haunt him for years. Around 5:30 p.m. on June 14th, approximately an hour after Dennis disappeared, Key heard what he described as an enormous, sickening scream echoing through the forest. The scream lasted only seconds, but it was unlike anything Key had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of an injured animal or a person calling for help. It was something that made his blood run cold and sent his family quickly back to their campsite. When Key reported this to investigators, it shifted the search focus toward the Sea Branch area where he had been camping. But Harold Key had more to report. Shortly after hearing the scream, he claimed to have seen a figure moving through the trees. He described it as a large, bearded man carrying something over his shoulder. The figure moved quickly through the forest, heading uphill away from the creek. Key said he also noticed a white sedan parked in an unusual location, partially hidden under tree branches near an old logging road. The investigators faced a dilemma with Key's testimony. Here was a credible witness, a professional engineer with no reason to fabricate his account. Yet his story suggested possibilities that were difficult to pursue. Was the figure he saw carrying Dennis Martin? Was this evidence of an abduction? Or had Key misinterpreted something innocent in the forest shadows? FBI agents joined the investigation as the possibility of kidnapping became part of the official inquiry. Special agents interviewed the Key family multiple times, trying to extract every detail from their memory. They searched the area where the white car had been spotted, looking for tire tracks or other evidence. They explored the possibility that Dennis had been taken by someone who had been watching the camping families. The massive search effort created its own problems. With over 1,400 people eventually involved, coordination became a nightmare. Searchers sometimes got lost themselves, requiring rescue. Communication between different groups broke down. Evidence was potentially contaminated by the sheer number of people moving through the search area. Dwight McCarter, a young park ranger in 1969, found himself working 18-hour days managing search teams and following up on leads. He watched families of volunteers bring food to base camp, saw Boy Scout troops methodically work their way through impossible terrain, and witnessed the Green Berets push themselves to their limits in terrain that challenged even their elite training. The emotional toll on the searchers grew heavier each day Dennis remained missing. These were people who had dropped everything in their lives to help find a child they had never met. They slept in tents, ate whatever food was available, and pushed themselves through exhaustion because they couldn't bear the thought of giving up. The Martin family struggled with their new reality. William Martin found himself torn between hope and despair as each day brought new leads that led nowhere. Family members arrived from other states to help with the search and provide support. The extended Martin family set up their own informal command post, tracking every piece of information and following up on every tip. As days turned into weeks, false identities began emerging from the search effort. People claimed to have seen Dennis in distant towns. Others reported finding children who might be the missing boy. Each potential sighting had to be investigated, taking precious resources away from the primary search area. The nurse who got lost. On a sunny Monday morning in July 2013, Geraldine Largay woke up in her tent beside the Appalachian Trail in western Maine, feeling proud of what she'd already accomplished. At 66 years old, the retired Air Force nurse from Brentwood, Tennessee had been hiking for 3 months and covered over 1,000 miles of America's most famous trail. Her friends on the trail knew her by the name Inchworm, a nickname that perfectly captured her steady, methodical approach to hiking. Jerry had always been a practical woman. After decades of caring for patients in military hospitals, she approached her through hike with the same careful planning she'd brought to her nursing career. This wasn't some midlife crisis adventure. It was a bucket list item she'd dreamed about for years. Her husband George had been incredibly supportive, driving up from Tennessee to meet her at road crossings every few days, bringing fresh supplies and sharing brief reunions before she continued north toward Mount Katahdin. July 22nd started like any other day on the trail. Jerry packed her gear, shouldered her backpack, and began hiking south of Rangeley, Maine. The forest was thick and green, the kind of wilderness that makes hikers feel both humbled and alive. But around midday, nature called, and Jerry made a decision that would change everything. She stepped off the clearly marked trail to find some privacy. In her own words, written in a text message that would never send, she got into some trouble. She'd gotten off the trail to go to the bathroom and now couldn't find her way back. What should have been a quick detour became a nightmare, as the dense Maine woods seemed to swallow the trail completely. Every direction looked the same, just endless trees and underbrush. George was waiting for her at Route 27, about 22 miles ahead. He had driven up from their meeting point in Andover and was expecting to see his wife emerge from the forest that evening, tired but smiling as always. When darkness fell and Jerry didn't appear, he knew something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, just 2 miles from the trail, Jerry was fighting a battle that would last nearly a month. She tried desperately to send text messages to George, typing out pleas for help on her cell phone. In some trouble, got off trail to go to BR, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? But the thick forest canopy and Maine's notorious dead zones meant none of her messages would ever reach him. She wasn't giving up, though. Jerry climbed to higher ground, hoping to find a cell signal. She tried again and again to send messages, each one more desperate than the last. But the wilderness had its own rules, and technology meant nothing here. As the days passed, Jerry documented her ordeal in a small notebook. Her entries start hopeful, then grow more realistic, and finally heartbreaking. She rationed her limited food supplies, tried to signal for help, and wrote letter after letter to her family. On August 6th, 15 days after she first got lost, she wrote the words that would later bring her family some measure of peace. "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Kerry. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me." Back in the world beyond the trees, one of the largest search operations in Maine's history was underway. Game wardens, state police, search aircraft, park rangers, and volunteer fire departments combed thousands of acres looking for any sign of inchworm. George never left the area, working with searchers, holding on to hope that his wife's nursing training and stubborn determination would keep her alive. The search teams were thorough and dedicated, but Maine's wilderness is vast and unforgiving. They were looking for one small woman in millions of acres of dense forest. Despite helicopter flyovers, ground teams with dogs, and thermal imaging equipment, they found no trace of her. Jerry's final journal entry was dated August 18, 2013, to 27 days after she first stepped off the trail. She had survived longer in the wilderness than most experienced outdoorsmen thought possible. Her nursing background had taught her to stay calm under pressure, to think methodically about problems, but even her professional training couldn't overcome the fundamental challenge she faced. She was trapped in a green maze with no way out, slowly starving as her body consumed itself. For over 2 years, Geraldine Largay remained one of Maine's most haunting missing persons cases. Her story spread through the hiking community and beyond, a reminder of how quickly the wilderness can turn dangerous. George never stopped believing they would find her, never stopped working with investigators who refused to give up on the case. In October 2015, a land surveyor working in Reddington Township made the discovery that would finally answer the question that had tormented George and their daughter Kerry for 26 months. About 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail, in the exact spot where she had been lost all along, they found Jerry's campsite, her remains, and the journal that told the story of her final weeks. The medical examiner determined she had died of starvation and exposure, curled up in her sleeping bag in a small clearing she'd made her final camp. Around her tent, searchers found evidence of her desperate attempts to survive and signal for help. She had tried everything a trained, intelligent woman could think of, but the forest had held her too tightly. Shadows in Shenandoah. The golden retriever wandered into the ranger station on its own, hungry and confused. Park officials at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia had never seen the dog before, but something about its distressed behavior told them this wasn't just a lost pet. The dog's collar had a name, Taj, and that single detail would eventually unlock one of the most haunting cold cases in national park history. On May 24, 1996, two young women from St. Cloud, Minnesota, had been hiking the Appalachian Trail with their beloved golden retriever. Julie Williams, 24, and Laura "Lolly" Winans, 26, were experienced outdoor enthusiasts who had planned this trip as both an adventure and a celebration of their relationship. They set up their campsite near Skyland Resort, in a backcountry area popular with hikers but remote enough to offer the solitude they were seeking. When the dog showed up alone at the ranger station, search teams immediately began combing the area. What they found on June 1st would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. The women's bodies were discovered at their campsite, bound and gagged, their throats slashed. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the hiking community and marked the beginning of what would become one of the FBI's most persistent cold case investigations. The initial investigation revealed disturbing details that painted a picture of calculated violence. Both women had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. The killer had taken time to bind their hands, suggesting this wasn't a crime of opportunity but something more deliberate and sinister. The remote location meant there were no witnesses, no security cameras, and initially no forensic evidence that could point investigators toward a suspect. What made this case particularly challenging was how it fit into a broader pattern of violence targeting women in isolated outdoor spaces. Investigators began examining similar cases across the national park system, looking for connections that might reveal a serial predator. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed profiles suggesting they were looking for someone who was comfortable in wilderness settings, someone who might have specifically chosen national parks as hunting grounds because of their isolation and limited law enforcement presence. For years, the investigation followed leads that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. Park rangers questioned thousands of hikers and campers who had been in the area around May 24th. They examined every piece of physical evidence collected from the crime scene, ran DNA analysis through every available database, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple states looking for similar attack patterns. The case took on added urgency as investigators realized this killer might strike again. They studied other unsolved murders in Shenandoah and surrounding parks, looking for signature elements that might connect different crimes. The methodical nature of the Williams-Winans murders suggested someone with experience, someone who had likely committed violent crimes before and might continue doing so. In parallel with the Virginia investigation, law enforcement agencies in Ohio were building their own files on Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a serial rapist whose pattern of violence against women had earned him multiple convictions. Jackson, born in 1947, had spent decades targeting women in the Cleveland area, using a combination of charm and brutality that made him particularly dangerous. His crimes showed an escalating pattern of violence that concerned investigators, who wondered if he might have graduated from assault to murder. Jackson's method of operation involved gaining his victims' trust before revealing his true nature. He was known to frequent outdoor areas and had been documented as an avid hiker who was familiar with trail systems and remote camping areas. This detail would later prove crucial as investigators began examining whether his knowledge of wilderness areas extended beyond Ohio. The breakthrough came through advances in DNA technology that weren't available during the initial investigation. In 2024, nearly 28 years after the murders, the FBI announced they had definitively linked Jackson to the crime scene through genetic evidence. The DNA match was so strong that investigators expressed confidence it would have led to a conviction. There was only a 1 in 2.6 trillion chance the genetic material belonged to someone else. By the time this identification was made, Jackson was already dead, having died in an Ohio prison in 2018 while serving time for other violent crimes. The timing meant he would never face trial for the Shenandoah murders, but it provided the closure that Julie's and Lolly's families had been seeking for nearly 3 decades. The resolution of this case opened new questions about Jackson's potential involvement in other unsolved crimes. Investigators are now examining whether his travels and outdoor activities might have brought him into contact with other victims across multiple states. His documented history of escalating violence, combined with his familiarity with hiking areas, has made him a person of interest in several other cold cases involving attacks on outdoor enthusiasts. The investigation also highlighted how the isolation that makes national parks appealing to visitors can also make them attractive to predators. the very qualities that draw people seeking peace and connection with nature. Remoteness, limited cell service, sparse law enforcement coverage can create opportunities for those who would exploit vulnerable situations. The Mountain Devil's Harvest. The first sign something was terribly wrong came from what searchers didn't find. On May 24, 1981, park rangers found blood splattered across the wooden floor of the Wapiti shelter along the Appalachian Trail in southwestern Virginia. But there were no bodies, no witnesses, and no clear answers about what had happened to the two young hikers who had been seen there just days before. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered personal belongings scattered around the shelter, a camera with the film mysteriously removed, a paperback book that 27-year-old Laura Susan Ramsey had planned to read during her hiking trip, and most chilling of all, a bloody fingerprint pressed into the pages of that book. The fingerprint would prove to be the key that unlocked one of the most notorious crimes in Appalachian Trail history, leading investigators to a quiet loner named Randall Lee Smith. Smith had grown up as an only child in Pearisburg, Virginia, a small town nestled in the mountains where everyone knew everyone else's business. The townspeople remembered his mother as a hard-working woman, but Randall himself was different, shy, socially awkward, and known throughout the community as someone who couldn't tell the truth about even the smallest things. His lies weren't sophisticated deceptions, just constant fabrications about everyday matters that left neighbours shaking their heads in bewilderment. Born on June 29, 1953, Smith had struggled to fit in anywhere throughout his life. He was the kind of person who seemed to hover at the edges of social situations, watching but never really participating. His familiarity with the mountains and hiking trails around his hometown made him a fixture in the wilderness areas, though he preferred to hike alone rather than join organised groups or make friends on the trail. The events that would make Smith infamous began in mid-May 1981, when two social workers from Maine arrived in Virginia to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail. Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Sue Ramsey, both 27 years old, weren't just hiking for pleasure. They were raising money for a school run by Mountford's mother. The couple had planned their trip carefully, excited about the adventure and the cause they were supporting. On the evening of May 19th, Mountford and Ramsey were settling in for the night at the Wapiti shelter when they encountered another hiker. Smith appeared at the shelter that evening, and in what seemed like typical trail hospitality, the three shared a meal together. Trail culture encourages such interactions. Hikers routinely share food, stories, and shelter space with strangers they meet along the way. But this evening would end in unspeakable violence. As the couple prepared for sleep, Smith revealed his true nature. He shot Mountford in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, then attacked Ramsey with a piece of iron before stabbing her multiple times with a knife and a long nail. The brutality of the attack suggested something far beyond a robbery gone wrong. This was the work of someone who took pleasure in causing pain and terror. Smith's actions after the murders revealed a calculated mind behind the violence. He dragged both bodies away from the shelter, placed them in their sleeping bags to contain the evidence, and buried them in shallow graves in the woods. He then methodically went through their belongings, taking what he wanted and removing the film from their camera, perhaps worried about what pictures they might have taken of him. The investigation that followed showed Smith's fatal mistake. That bloody fingerprint on Ramsey's book provided investigators with the evidence they needed to identify their suspect. When police searched Smith's home in Pearisburg, they found a treasure trove of evidence linking him to the crime. Items belonging to both victims, including a pair of blue jeans soaked with blood. Smith fled Virginia when he realized investigators were closing in, but his capture was inevitable. Police tracked him to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where he was arrested without incident. Even then, he maintained the lying behavior that had characterized his entire life, offering multiple conflicting stories about what had happened at the shelter. Despite having overwhelming evidence against him, prosecutors struggled with one crucial element: motive. Smith offered no coherent explanation for why he had killed two strangers who had shown him nothing but kindness. The randomness of the crime made it even more terrifying for the hiking community, who realized that no amount of caution or trail experience could have protected Mountford and Ramsey from Smith's violence. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, Smith eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that could have resulted in the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and received a 30-year prison sentence. For the families of his victims, it felt like inadequate justice for such a heinous crime, but it at least guaranteed that Smith would spend decades behind bars. The case established Smith as the first known Appalachian Trail killer, creating a dark precedent that would haunt the trail community for years to come. His crimes shattered the sense of safety that many hikers had felt on the trail, proving that even America's most beloved hiking path wasn't immune to predatory violence. When evil returns, some people believe in second chances. They believe that prison can change a person, that years behind bars can reshape someone into a different human being. But sometimes evil isn't something you rehabilitate. Sometimes it just waits. May 6, 2008. Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston had been friends for years, 2 men from Bluefield, Virginia who shared a love for the outdoors. They'd planned this fishing trip to Dismal Creek for weeks, looking forward to catching trout and camping under the stars. The creek runs through some of the most beautiful wilderness in Virginia, just off the Appalachian Trail. Clear water, peaceful surroundings, the kind of place where you go to forget about the world's problems. What they didn't know was that 27 years earlier, in this exact same area, 2 hikers had been brutally murdered. In 1981, a local man named Randall Lee Smith had killed Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Ramsey at Wapiti Shelter, less than 2 miles from where Sean and Scott were now setting up camp. Smith had spent time talking with the couple, appearing friendly and helpful, before pulling out a .22 caliber pistol and shooting them both in cold blood. He'd been arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 2 concurrent 15-year terms for second-degree murder. The system worked, or so everyone thought. Smith served his time at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, one of Tennessee's toughest prisons. For 15 years he remained largely isolated, receiving no visitors, no letters, no contact with the outside world. Prison officials noted his quiet demeanour, his lack of disciplinary issues. He seemed like a model prisoner, someone who had learned from his mistakes. In 1996, Smith walked out of prison on mandatory parole. The state of Virginia had determined that he had paid his debt to society. He returned to his hometown of Pearisburg, just a few miles from where he'd committed his original crimes. For 12 years he lived quietly, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. The Appalachian Trail community slowly forgot about him, or at least hoped he was no longer a threat. But on that spring evening in 2008, as Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston cast their lines into Dismal Creek, Randall Lee Smith was walking through the woods again. The 2 friends had arrived separately at the creek, meeting up to fish the afternoon away. As evening approached, they began setting up camp, preparing to spend the night under the open sky. That's when they encountered a stranger who introduced himself as Ricky Williams. He seemed friendly enough, even claimed he'd been fishing with Scott earlier that afternoon. When they offered to share their campfire, Ricky gratefully accepted. For hours, the 3 men sat around the fire talking about fishing, the outdoors, life in general. Ricky seemed helpful, offering to collect firewood for the group. He appeared to be just another outdoorsman enjoying the Virginia wilderness. Sean and Scott had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But as the evening wore on, something changed. Without warning, without provocation, Ricky Williams pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and began shooting. The attack was sudden and vicious. Sean took 2 bullets, Scott was hit twice as well. Both men fell to the ground, bleeding and in shock, but somehow still alive. Their attacker stood over them, gun in hand, as if deciding what to do next. In that moment of chaos, the 2 friends made a decision that would save their lives. Despite their wounds, despite the pain and terror, they ran. Scott managed to reach his truck. Sean stumbled after him, and together they fled down the Rocky Mountain Road. What followed was a desperate race for survival. Scott drove while bleeding from his wounds, Sean beside him, both men knowing they needed to find help quickly or they would die. They managed to reach the home of Melissa Miller, who immediately called 911 and began administering first aid. Her quick thinking and medical knowledge kept both men alive until helicopters could airlift them to the hospital. Meanwhile, their attacker had made his own desperate move. Ricky Williams had climbed into Scott's abandoned truck and attempted to flee the scene, but the rocky terrain and his own panic proved too much. The truck crashed and Ricky Williams was injured in the accident. When police arrived and identified the shooter, they discovered something chilling. Ricky Williams was not his real name. The man who had just attempted to murder 2 innocent campers was Randall Lee Smith, the same killer who had murdered 2 hikers in virtually the same location 27 years earlier. The parallels were terrifying. The same isolated location along the Appalachian Trail, the same friendly approach, gaining victims' trust before striking, the same .22 caliber weapon, even the same methodical execution style. It was as if Smith had simply picked up where he'd left off in 1981, as if the 15 years in prison had been nothing more than an intermission in his killing spree. Smith died 4 days later from complications related to his injuries from the truck crash. He would never face trial for the 2008 attempted murders, never have to explain why he'd returned to his killing ground, never reveal what had driven him back to violence after 12 years of apparent quiet living. Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston survived, but their recovery took months. Multiple surgeries, extensive rehabilitation, and the psychological trauma of knowing they'd encountered pure evil in one of nature's most peaceful settings. They still bear the scars today, both physical and emotional reminders of their encounter with a killer who should never have been free to strike again. The 2008 attack raised uncomfortable questions about the justice system, about parole decisions, about whether some criminals can ever truly be rehabilitated. Smith had served his full sentence, had been released according to the law, had shown no signs of renewed violence for over a decade. Yet when opportunity presented itself, he returned to killing as easily as putting on an old coat. 2 miles separated the 1981 murders from the 2008 attack. 27 years separated the crimes. But in Randall Lee Smith's mind, it seemed like no time had passed at all. The Thelma Marks shelter horror. Sometimes the most evil acts happen in the most beautiful places. Sometimes violence finds you where you least expect it, in spaces that feel sacred and safe. And sometimes the very thing that makes you feel secure becomes the thing that seals your fate. The Thelma Marks shelter sat in a peaceful clearing high on Cove Mountain, just outside Duncannon, Pennsylvania. It was one of those places that hikers called magical, tucked away from the world, surrounded by sassafras and tulip trees, carpeted with ferns and wildflowers. The old log lean-to had sheltered thousands of weary hikers over the decades, offering them rest and protection from the elements. On the morning of September the 13th, 1990, 2 bodies were discovered there. Jeffrey Hood had been shot 3 times and was positioned as if sleeping peacefully in a corner of the shelter. Molly LaRue lay face down in a pool of blood, her hands bound behind her back with rope that had been looped around her neck. She had been raped and stabbed 8 times. What made this crime even more shocking was that these weren't random victims. Jeff and Molly were experienced hikers who had been walking the Appalachian Trail for over 3 months. They were careful, smart, and well prepared. They'd started their journey in Maine back in June, following the dreams that so many hikers share, to walk the entire 180-mile trail from Mount Katahdin to Springer Mountain in Georgia. But investigators soon learned this wasn't a chance encounter. Someone had been hunting on the trail. 2 nights earlier, a bearded stranger carrying bright red gym bags had been spotted trudging along the trail road near the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Karen Lutz, who worked for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, had seen him during her survey work. Something about the man filled her with dread. His filthy appearance, his combat boots, his joyless march toward the mountains. He wasn't dressed like a hiker, and he didn't move like someone who belonged in the woods. What Lutz didn't know was that the man was carrying a long-barreled .22 caliber revolver, 50 rounds of ammunition, and a double-edged knife nearly 9 inches long. She also didn't know that he was a wanted fugitive who had been hiding from authorities for 4 years. The investigation began with the discovery itself. Biff and Cindy Bowen, a married couple from Virginia, had been chasing Jeff and Molly for weeks, reading their cheerful entries in shelter logbooks and hoping to catch up with them. When they reached the Thelma Marks shelter around 6 o'clock that evening, they expected to find their fellow hikers cooking dinner and sharing stories around the fire. Instead, they found silence. The clearing was eerily quiet, with none of the usual sounds of camp life. Something felt wrong immediately. After approaching the shelter and making the horrific discovery, the Bowens rushed back down the mountain to call police. State troopers struggled for 3 hours in the darkness to reach the remote crime scene, cursing their way up the steep rocky trail in dress shoes. When they finally arrived with flashlights, the full horror of what had happened became clear. The shelter floor was covered in blood. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere, and both victims showed signs of having been attacked while they slept. The killer had been methodical. He'd taken Jeff's expensive green Gregory backpack, his hiking boots and his wristwatch. He'd left behind his own gear, the red gym bags that Karen Lutz had noticed, along with a bus ticket and a library note that would prove crucial to the investigation. That note led police to a library in East Berlin, Pennsylvania, where someone calling himself Casey Horn had asked for hiking maps just days before the murders. But Casey Horn wasn't his real name. Through fingerprints and criminal databases, investigators discovered their suspect was actually Paul David Cruz, a 38-year-old drifter from South Carolina with a violent past. Cruz had been on the run since 1986, when he'd been charged with murder in Florida. A woman who had given him a ride home from a bar had been found nearly decapitated on an abandoned railroad track. Police had found her bloodied car at his brother's house, along with Cruz's knife and bloody clothes, but Cruz himself had vanished into the countryside. For 4 years he'd managed to stay hidden, moving from job to job, never staying in one place too long. He worked on tobacco farms, picked oranges, and lived in shacks and cheap motels. Those who knew him described him as smart but secretive, prone to long unexplained absences and heavy drinking. The manhunt for Cruz lasted 8 days. While police searched the area far around Duncannon, Cruz had already moved on. After committing the murders, he'd hiked north to the trail road, hitched a ride to Interstate 81, and then travelled south before rejoining the Appalachian Trail in another county. He was now posing as a thru hiker himself, using Jeff and Molly's story as his cover, even claiming he was trying to catch up with another hiker they'd known. But his disguise wouldn't last long. On September 21, 1990, Cruz was walking across a bridge from Maryland into West Virginia when another hiker recognized Jeff's distinctive green backpack. The hiker contacted authorities, and federal park rangers arrested Cruz without incident. When they searched him, investigators found overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He was wearing Jeff's hiking boots and wristwatch. He was carrying both murder weapons, the .22 caliber revolver and the long knife. DNA evidence would later link him to Molly's rape. His own gear, left behind at the crime scene, was traced back to the tobacco farm where he'd been working just days before the attack. At his trial in May 1991, Cruz offered no explanation for his actions. He spoke in monosyllables to police, said almost nothing in court, and never described why he'd chosen Jeff and Molly as his victims. His defense attorney believed Cruz had been high on cocaine and drunk on whiskey when he committed the murders, but even that didn't explain the calculated brutality of his actions. The prosecution presented 60 witnesses and 158 pieces of evidence. They painted a picture of a predator who had deliberately sought out victims on the trail, someone who'd planned violence from the moment he left South Carolina. A psychiatrist testified that Cruz suffered from organic aggressive syndrome, triggered by his drug and alcohol use, but it was a thin excuse for such savage acts. The case revealed troubling gaps in the mental health and criminal justice systems. Cruz had slipped through the cracks for years, moving from state to state, never receiving treatment for his obvious psychological problems. His history of violence against women had been documented but never properly addressed. He was a time bomb that had been allowed to keep ticking. The murders shocked the hiking community and changed how people thought about safety on the trail. For decades, hikers had believed that the wilderness was a refuge from urban violence, that dangers came from bears and weather, not from other human beings. The Thelma Marks murders shattered that innocence. Trail organizations began publishing safety guides and encouraging hikers to be more cautious. Some people started carrying pepper spray or traveling with dogs. Shelter logbooks, once filled with cheerful messages and trail information, now sometimes contained warnings about suspicious individuals. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was how preventable it might have been. Cruz had been identified as a murder suspect years earlier. He'd been living and working under his real name. If law enforcement agencies had better communication, if mental health resources had been available, if someone had recognized the warning signs, Jeff and Molly might still be alive. Instead, they became victims of a system that failed to protect them from a predator who should never have been free to hunt again. Their deaths at the Thelma Marks shelter remain a reminder that evil can find us anywhere, even in the most beautiful places on Earth. The quiet historian, some mysteries don't scream at you from the headlines. They whisper from the woods, carried on the wind like fragments of prayers that never reach their destination. They're found in text messages that were never sent, in journal pages that no one was meant to read, in final words written to people who would search for years before finding them. On October 14, 2015, 2 forest surveyors working in the remote wilderness of western Maine stumbled upon something that had been hidden for more than 2 years. Deep in the woods, just 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail, they found the remains of Geraldine Largay. She was inside her sleeping bag, in what appeared to be a makeshift camp with her journal lying open beside her. The mystery wasn't how she died. The mystery was how a woman who had planned every detail of her hike, who carried GPS equipment and emergency supplies, who followed safety protocols better than most seasoned hikers, had simply vanished without a trace in July 2013. The mystery was how the largest search and rescue operation in Maine's history had failed to find someone who was so close to where they were looking. Gerry Largay wasn't just any hiker who got lost in the woods. She was a retired Air Force nurse from Tennessee, a woman who approached her dream of hiking the Appalachian Trail with the precision of someone who had spent her career saving lives. She had spreadsheets that tracked every mile, every supply drop, every meeting point with her husband George. She carried maps, a GPS device, and enough emergency equipment to handle most situations. Her trail name was Inchworm because she joked about her slow but steady pace. But on July 22, 2013, all that preparation couldn't save her from one simple mistake. According to the text messages and journal entries found with her body, Gerry had stepped off the trail to relieve herself. When she tried to get back to the trail, she couldn't find it. That's all it took. A few steps in the wrong direction, and the forest swallowed her whole. Her family had no way of knowing that when George Largay waited at their planned meeting point on Route 27, his wife was already lost. She'd sent him a text that morning at 7:15 saying she was heading to Spalding Mountain Lean-To. It was the last communication that would reach the outside world, though she didn't know it yet. What happened next would haunt George and their daughter Kerry for years. When Gerry didn't show up at their meeting point, George figured the heavy rains had delayed her. He slept in their car, waiting. The next day he contacted police. The search began immediately, but it was already too late. Gerry was lost in terrain so dense that searchers walking within a few hundred yards of her camp would never see it. The search effort was massive. More than 100 wardens, volunteers and rescue workers scoured over 30 miles of wilderness. They used dogs, horses and helicopters. They searched streams, thinking she might have fallen into the rain-swollen waters. They covered side trails, old logging roads and abandoned campsites. Search dogs picked up her scent in various locations, but the leads always went cold. For George and Kerry, those days stretched into an agony of waiting and wondering. They stayed in Maine for weeks, following every lead, hoping for any sign. Kerry later told reporters that the family went through every possible scenario, but none of them made sense. Gerry was too experienced to just wander off. She knew to stay put if she got lost. She had emergency supplies and knew how to use them. The search continued through the summer of 2013, then resumed in the spring of 2014. Volunteers and professionals covered the same ground multiple times. The Maine Warden Service, which leads such operations, had a success rate of finding missing persons within 24 hours 98% of the time. But Gerry Largay became part of that terrible 2%. As months turned into years, George and Kerry had to learn to live with not knowing. They established a reward fund that eventually grew to $25,000. They kept in touch with search coordinators, hoping for new leads or new technology that might help. But the wilderness had taken Gerry completely, leaving no trace for searchers to follow. What they didn't know was that Gerry was fighting her own battle against time and the elements just a short distance from where they were searching. The journal entries and text messages found with her body told the story of those final weeks. She tried repeatedly to send text messages to George, climbing to higher ground to get a signal that never came. The messages were heartbreaking in their desperation and love. In some trouble, got off trail to go to BR, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road, Exox, she texted on July 22nd, though the message never sent. On July 24th, she tried again. Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for help, please. Getting weak. Her journal entries showed that she understood the gravity of her situation. She rationed her food and water. She tried to signal for help. She built shelters and moved her camp multiple times, always hoping to find a way back to the trail or to a place where rescuers might see her. But the forest kept its secrets. The most devastating entry came weeks later, when she had accepted her fate. When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Kerry. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. George Largay received that message on May 26, 2016, when Maine authorities released details of what had been found with his wife's remains. By then, he'd been living with uncertainty for nearly 3 years. The knowledge of how she died brought some closure, but also revealed the cruelest truth of all. She'd been so close to rescue for so long. The forest surveyors who found her weren't even looking for her. They were conducting a timber survey when they noticed what appeared to be camping gear in the woods. When they realized what they had discovered, they immediately contacted authorities. An investigation confirmed that the remains were those of Geraldine Largay, and that she had survived in the wilderness for at least 26 days after getting lost. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had such a massive search effort missed someone who was only 2 miles from the trail? How had she survived for nearly a month with limited supplies? And most haunting of all, what might have happened if just one of her text messages had gone through, or if searchers had expanded their grid just a little bit further? For the hiking community, Jerry's story became a sobering reminder that the wilderness doesn't care how prepared you are. It doesn't matter if you've read every guidebook, taken every safety course, or packed every piece of emergency equipment. Sometimes all it takes is a few wrong steps to change everything. Her story also highlighted the limitations of even the most dedicated search and rescue efforts. The terrain where she was found was so thick with vegetation that her camp was invisible from just a few yards away. Search teams had been close. But close isn't enough in the wilderness. George Largay never stopped believing that someday he would get answers. When they finally came, they weren't the answers he had hoped for, but they were the ones he needed. His wife had fought to survive, and she had died thinking of him and Kerry. Her final words were messages of love, instructions for those who would eventually find her, and the quiet dignity of someone who faced death alone but never stopped hoping for rescue. The woods of western Maine still hold their secrets, but they gave back Geraldine Largay, the quiet historian who documented her final days with the same careful attention to detail that had marked her entire life. Her story reminds us that some mysteries solve themselves, in their own time, in their own way. 2 girls who never came home. There's something about teenage girls that breaks our hearts when they vanish. Maybe it's because we see in them all the dreams they'll never get to chase, all the birthdays they'll never celebrate, all the women they'll never become. When a 16-year-old disappears without a trace, it leaves a wound in the world that never quite heals, a question that echoes through decades. What happened to that bright young girl who should have grown up to be someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's best friend? October 8, 1976 started like any other autumn morning in Knoxville, Tennessee. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. At Bearden High School, 40 students were loading onto a yellow school bus, excited about their field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They were taking a horticulture class, and their teacher, Wayne Dunlap, had planned a day of hiking to Andrews Bald to study the mountain's unique ecosystem. Teresa Lynn Gibson, who everyone called Trenny, climbed onto that bus like any other 16-year-old heading out for a school adventure. She had shoulder-length brown hair, hazel eyes, and stood about 5 feet 3 inches tall. She was wearing jeans, a blue shirt, and tennis shoes. Her best friend wasn't on the trip, so she sat next to Robert Simpson, a classmate she'd known for years. As the bus wound its way through the mountains toward Klingman's Dome, Trenny seemed perfectly normal, chatting with friends and looking forward to the hike. What happened next would become one of the most enduring mysteries in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history, and it wasn't the first time the mountains had swallowed a child whole. 7 years earlier, on June 14, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin had vanished from Spence Field during a Father's Day camping trip with his family. Dennis had been playing a game of hide-and-seek with his father and older brother when he ran behind a tree and simply never came back. Despite the largest search in national park history at that time, involving hundreds of people, helicopters and bloodhounds, Dennis was never found. Not a single piece of clothing, not a footprint, not even a trace. The Martin case had shocked the Park Service and the public. How does a 6-year-old boy just disappear in broad daylight with people all around him? The search for Dennis lasted 9 days and covered thousands of acres. Rangers brought in everything they had: search dogs, helicopters, volunteers from across the region, but the mountains kept their secret. Now, 7 years later, the mountains were about to claim another child. The Bearden High students reached Andrews Bald around noon after hiking the Forney Ridge Trail from the Klingman's Dome parking area. Andrews Bald was one of the park's famous grassy meadows, a beautiful open space surrounded by forest where students could see for miles across the Smoky Mountains. The group spread out to eat lunch and study the unique plant life that grew in the high-elevation meadow. After lunch, some students wanted to explore more, while others were ready to head back to the bus. Trenny decided to start the return hike, but Robert Simpson wanted to stay at the Bald a little longer. She borrowed his jacket because the mountain air was getting chilly, and she set off down the trail by herself. Several students saw her walking down the Forney Ridge Trail, which was well marked and considered one of the easier trails in the park. The path was about 3 feet wide, with dense undergrowth and steep drop-offs on both sides. Angela Beckner, Lisa Michaels and Bobby Coghill all remembered seeing Trenny walking ahead of them on the trail. She was moving at a steady pace, wearing Robert's distinctive jacket, and seemed to know exactly where she was going. And then, somewhere between Andrews Bald and the parking area, Trenny Gibson vanished. When the other students reached the bus, they expected to find Trenny waiting for them. When she wasn't there, they figured she was just running late. But as more students arrived and there was still no sign of her, teacher Wayne Dunlap began to worry. By 4:30, with all the other students accounted for and the bus scheduled to leave, Dunlap made the decision to contact park rangers. What followed was a massive search effort that dwarfed even the Dennis Martin case. Within hours, park rangers had mobilized search teams. By the next morning, the operation had grown to include 756 people. Park Service personnel, volunteers, local law enforcement, and specialized search teams. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and ground crews that covered every inch of terrain for miles around. The search continued for 2 weeks. Dogs picked up Trenny's scent in various locations, but could never track it to a conclusion. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the rugged terrain. Ground crews searched ravines, cliff faces, and dense forest areas where a person might have fallen or gotten lost. Rangers interviewed every student on the field trip, looking for any detail that might provide a clue. But just like with Dennis Martin, the mountains revealed nothing. The similarities between the two cases were striking and troubling. Both involved children who disappeared in broad daylight from well-travelled areas of the park. Both vanished without leaving any physical evidence behind. Both searches involved hundreds of people and went on for days or weeks without finding so much as a piece of clothing or a footprint. In the case of Trenny Gibson, investigators considered every possibility. Could she have fallen off the trail into one of the steep ravines? The terrain was searched thoroughly, including areas where a body might have been hidden by undergrowth or rockfall. Could she have gotten lost and wandered off the main trail? Search teams covered miles of wilderness in every direction from where she was last seen. Could she have been picked up by someone with a car? The parking area and nearby roads were investigated, but there were no witnesses to any suspicious activity. The most disturbing theory was that Trenny had been abducted. Some investigators focused on a fellow student from Bearden High named Kelvin Bowman, who had reportedly made threatening comments about Trenny in the past and had a history of violence. But Bowman had an alibi for the day of the field trip, and there was no evidence connecting him to Trenny's disappearance. Other theories emerged over the years. Some people suggested that Trenny had run away, that she had deliberately left her old life behind to start fresh somewhere else. But this theory made little sense. Trenny had left her purse, her money, and all her personal belongings at home that morning. She wasn't carrying anything except the clothes on her back and Robert's jacket. She had no known reasons for wanting to disappear, no problems at home or school that would drive a 16-year-old to such drastic action. As the weeks turned to months and then years, the Gibson family's hope slowly transformed into a different kind of grief. Trenny's father, Robert Gibson Sr., never stopped believing that someday he would get answers. He organised additional searches, posted rewards, and followed up on every tip and lead, but the mountains had taken his daughter as completely as they had taken Dennis Martin. The impact on the family was devastating. Trenny's parents divorced. Her older brother, Robert Jr., struggled with survivor's guilt and died in 2000 at the age of 42. Her father died in 2004, still without answers. Her sister Tina carried the burden of being the only surviving child until her own death in 2016. The pattern would continue. In 1981, 5 years after Trenny's disappearance, 58-year-old Thelma Polly Melton vanished while hiking the Deep Creek Trail in the same park. Polly was hiking with two friends when she walked ahead and simply vanished. Like Dennis and Trenny, she left no trace. The search for Polly followed the same pattern: hundreds of searchers, tracking dogs, helicopters, and absolutely no evidence of what had happened. Park officials began to notice the similarities between these cases. All three involved people who disappeared during daylight hours from well-used trails. All three vanished completely, leaving no physical evidence behind. All three generated massive search efforts that found nothing. The cases seemed to follow a pattern that defied explanation. Some researchers have suggested that the Great Smoky Mountains has an unusually high rate of unexplained disappearances. The park sees millions of visitors every year, and while most enjoy their visit and return home safely, a small number simply vanish. The terrain is challenging, with dense forests, steep ravines, and unpredictable weather that can turn deadly quickly. Wild animals, though rare, could potentially account for some disappearances, but the cases of Dennis Martin, Trenny Gibson, and Polly Melton stand apart because of their witnesses and circumstances. These weren't solo hikers who might have gotten lost or injured in remote areas. These were people who disappeared from populated trails with other people nearby. The search techniques and technology have improved dramatically since 1976. Modern search teams use GPS tracking, thermal imaging, and sophisticated communication systems. Cell phones and GPS devices mean that many hikers can call for help or be located even when they're lost. But in Trenny's time, once you walked away from other people on a mountain trail, you were truly alone. Theories about what happens to people who vanish in national parks range from the mundane to the bizarre. Some suggest that victims fall into hidden caves or crevices that are impossible to spot from the surface. Others point to the possibility of human predators who know the terrain well enough to abduct people without leaving evidence. Still others propose more exotic explanations, involving everything from Bigfoot to interdimensional portals. But for the families left behind, the theories matter less than the absence. Trenny Gibson would be in her 60s now if she were still alive. She might have had children and grandchildren. She might have become a teacher or a nurse or followed any of the dreams that 16-year-olds carry with them. Instead, she exists in a kind of suspended animation, forever young, forever walking down that mountain trail on an October afternoon in 1976. The case files remain open, though active investigation ceased years ago. Every few years, someone claims to have new information or a new theory, but none have led to answers. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to attract millions of visitors who hike the same trails where Dennis, Trenny, and Polly disappeared. Most return home with nothing more than tired feet and happy memories. But somewhere in those ancient mountains, 3 people became part of a mystery that has never been solved. Their disappearances remind us that, for all our modern technology and search techniques, there are still places where people can vanish as completely as if they had never existed at all. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets include the children who never came home. The woman in the mist. The mist rolls through the Maine woods like a living thing, wrapping around spruce trees and settling in low places where streams cut through the forest. In these mountains, you can be 10 feet from the trail and lose it completely. You can be shouting distance from help and never be heard, and you can disappear so completely that it takes 2 years to find you, even when hundreds of people are looking. On October the 14th, 2015, a surveyor working timberland near Reddington Township was walking through dense woods when something caught his eye. Hidden beneath a canopy of trees, covered in moss and decay, was a small tent. Inside that tent were the remains of Geraldine Largay, a 66-year-old woman who had vanished from the Appalachian Trail 2 years earlier. Next to her body was a journal with a message written on the cover. "George, please read XOXO." To understand how Gerry Largay ended up dying alone in the Maine wilderness, you have to go back to Tennessee, where she lived with her husband George in a comfortable suburban home in Brentwood. Gerry had been a nurse for most of her adult life, spending her final working years caring for Air Force veterans. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in, always quick with a joke or a story. Her friends knew her as someone who embraced life fully, who wasn't afraid to try new things even in her 60s. The dream of hiking the Appalachian Trail had been growing in Gerry's mind for years. She'd done plenty of day hikes and short backpacking trips, but the trail represented something bigger. It was a chance to test herself, to spend months walking through the most beautiful parts of the eastern United States, to be part of a community of hikers who understood what it meant to live simply and move slowly through the world. George supported his wife's dream, even though he knew it meant months apart. They worked out a system where he would drive to road crossings along the trail, meeting Gerry every few days to resupply her with food and gear. It was their way of staying connected while she pursued this adventure that had captured her imagination. Gerry started her hike at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, in April 2013. Like many hikers, she took a trail name that reflected something about her personality or hiking style. She chose Inchworm because she was a slow but steady walker. While other hikers might cover 20 miles in a day, Gerry was content to walk 8 or 10, taking time to notice wildflowers and talk to other people she met along the way. By July 2013, Gerry had been hiking for 3 months and had covered more than 1,000 miles. She was in Maine, working her way through some of the most challenging terrain on the entire trail. The mountains in western Maine are steep and rocky, with thick forests that can make navigation difficult even for experienced hikers. On July 21, 2013, Gerry spent the night at the Poplar Ridge Lean-To, a 3-sided shelter about 15 miles south of Rangeley, Maine. She wrote in the shelter logbook, as hikers always do, leaving a cheerful message about her progress and her plans to meet George the next day at Route 27. The morning of July 22nd started like any other day on the trail. Gerry packed up her gear, said goodbye to other hikers at the shelter, and set off north toward her meeting point with George. The weather was warm and humid, with thick clouds hanging low over the mountains. Visibility was poor, the kind of day when the forest seems to press in around you. Around midday, Gerry stepped off the trail to relieve herself. It was something she'd done hundreds of times during her hike, something so routine that she probably didn't think twice about it. But this time, when she tried to return to the trail, she couldn't find it. The thick vegetation and poor visibility had completely disoriented her. What happened next is documented in Gerry's own words, written in a small journal she carried with her. She tried to find her way back to the trail, following what she thought were paths but which turned out to be old logging roads or game trails. She climbed ridges hoping to get a better view of the surrounding area, but the thick canopy blocked any useful landmarks. As the afternoon wore on, Gerry realized she was truly lost. She tried to send a text message to George. "In some trouble, got off trail to go to BR and now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail maintainer can help me? Somewhere north of Woods Road. Zox." But there was no cell service in that remote part of Maine. The message never sent. George was waiting at Route 27, expecting his wife to arrive sometime that afternoon. When she didn't show up, he wasn't immediately concerned. Gerry was often later than expected, and he knew the terrain in this part of Maine could slow down even experienced hikers. But as evening fell and there was still no sign of her, he began to worry. The next morning, when Gerry still hadn't arrived, George contacted the Maine Warden Service. Within hours, search and rescue teams were combing the area around where she was last seen. They used helicopters, search dogs, and teams of volunteers to cover hundreds of square miles of dense forest. The search for Gerry Largay became one of the most intensive in Maine's history. For weeks, wardens and volunteers searched every trail, every logging road, every stream crossing in the area. They followed up on dozens of reported sightings, most of which turned out to be false leads. The thick Maine woods seemed to have swallowed her completely. Meanwhile, less than 3 miles from where searchers were looking, Gerry was fighting for survival. Her journal entries from those first days show someone who was scared but still hopeful. She rationed her food carefully, tried to signal for help, and built a shelter using her tent and pine boughs. As days turned into weeks, Jerry's journal entries became more desperate. She was running out of food and had been unable to find any reliable source of water. Her attempts to signal for help by blowing a whistle and leaving bright clothing in clearings had gone unnoticed. On August 6th, 2 weeks after she'd disappeared, Jerry wrote, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Kerry. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now." Jerry's final journal entry was dated August 18th, nearly a month after she'd gotten lost. She'd survived for 26 days in the Maine wilderness, longer than many survival experts would have thought possible. Her remains were found in her sleeping bag inside her tent, suggesting that she had died peacefully in her sleep. The medical examiner determined that Jerry had died of starvation and exposure. The location where her body was found was only about 2.5 miles from the Appalachian Trail, but it was in such thick forest that searchers had walked within 100 yards of her campsite without seeing it. The discovery of Jerry's remains brought some closure to her family, but it also raised difficult questions about wilderness search and rescue. Despite one of the most extensive search efforts in Maine's history, she'd been missed by just a few hundred feet. The thick Maine woods, which had given her so much joy during her months on the trail, had ultimately claimed her life. The Meredith Emerson tragedy. Some people find peace in the mountains. They go there to clear their heads, to feel their hearts beat hard from the climb, to remember what it feels like to be truly alive. For 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, the mountains of North Georgia were a second home. She'd climbed Blood Mountain dozens of times with her black Labrador mix named Ella, and she thought of it as one of the safest places in the world. On New Year's Day 2008, she would discover how wrong she was. Meredith woke up that morning in her apartment in Beaufort, Georgia, with plans for a perfect start to the new year. She was a University of Georgia graduate with a degree in French, working as a sales manager. But her real passion was the outdoors. She ran marathons, lifted weights, and hiked almost every weekend. Her friends knew her as someone who was careful and prepared, someone who carried pepper spray and a police baton when she hiked alone. She wasn't the kind of person who took foolish risks. Around 10 in the morning, she loaded Ella into her 1995 Chevrolet Cavalier and drove the hour north to Vogel State Park and the Blood Mountain trailhead. Blood Mountain was the highest peak on the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, standing 4,458 feet above sea level. The trail to the summit was well marked and popular, even in January. It was the kind of hike Meredith could do in her sleep. At the same time, 61-year-old Gary Michael Hilton was prowling the same area. Hilton had been living as a drifter for months, sleeping in his white van and hunting the hiking trails of the southeastern United States for victims. He was a large man with long grey hair and a scraggly beard, and he had already killed at least 3 people. But nobody knew that yet. Sometime around noon on that crisp January day, Hilton spotted Meredith and Ella on the Blood Mountain Trail. Later, he would tell investigators that he had been looking for a lone female hiker, someone he could overpower and rob. He approached Meredith under the pretense of asking for directions, then attacked her. Despite her physical fitness and the pepper spray and baton she carried, Meredith was no match for Hilton's size and the surprise of his assault. What happened next was a 4-day nightmare that would haunt everyone who learned the details. Hilton forced Meredith to hike deeper into the woods, away from the main trail where other hikers might find them. He kept her captive, demanding that she give him the PIN number for her debit card so he could access her bank account. When she gave him a wrong number, either by mistake or on purpose, he became enraged. Meredith's friends began to worry when she didn't return their calls on January 2nd. They knew her routine, knew she was responsible about checking in. By that evening, they had driven to Vogel State Park and found her car still parked at the trailhead. Inside the car were her purse, her water bottle, and Ella's leash. There was no sign of Meredith or her dog. The search for Meredith began immediately. Park rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers combed the trails around Blood Mountain. Search dogs tried to pick up her scent. Helicopters flew overhead looking for any sign of movement in the dense forest. But the January weather was cold and wet and the terrain was challenging. As the hours turned into days, hope began to fade. On January 4th, 3 days after Meredith disappeared, a witness called police to report something suspicious. They'd seen an older man with long grey hair cleaning out a white van at a Chevron gas station in nearby Gainesville. The man seemed nervous and was scrubbing the van obsessively. When police arrived, they found Gary Hilton still at the gas station. Crime scene investigators found blood in his van that would later be matched to Meredith's DNA. Under questioning, Hilton eventually broke down and confessed. He told investigators that he had kept Meredith alive for 4 days, hoping to get money from her bank account. When the PIN number she gave him didn't work, and when he realised that the massive search effort meant he was running out of time, he'd killed her with a tyre iron. He led investigators to where he had hidden her body in the Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area. The details that emerged during Hilton's confession were horrific. He had forced Meredith to hike for miles through rough terrain while she was his captive. He had tied her up and left her alone in the cold while he went to try to use her debit card. Most heartbreakingly, he told investigators that Meredith had fought to stay alive, that she had tried to build a relationship with him, talking to him about his life and trying to convince him to let her go. In a twisted show of what he seemed to think was mercy, Hilton had let Ella live. The dog was found wandering near where Meredith's body was discovered, confused and hungry, but alive. For investigators and Meredith's family, Ella's survival was both a small comfort and a painful reminder of what had been lost. The arrest of Gary Hilton revealed that Meredith was not his first victim. Investigators linked him to the murders of John and Irene Bryant, an elderly couple who had disappeared while hiking in North Carolina in 2007, and Cheryl Dunlap, a nurse and mother who had vanished while hiking in Florida. Hilton had been targeting hikers across the southeast, using the remote locations and his knowledge of the trails to ambush his victims. Meredith's murder sent shockwaves through the hiking community. She had done everything right. She was experienced, she carried protection, she hiked a popular trail in daylight. If someone like Meredith could be attacked and killed, then no one was truly safe. The case changed how many people thought about solo hiking, especially for women. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Hilton pleaded guilty to Meredith's murder in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. He also pleaded guilty to killing the Bryants and was sentenced to death in Florida for Cheryl Dunlap's murder. During his sentencing, he showed no remorse, describing the murders in cold, clinical terms that made clear he saw his victims as nothing more than objects. For Meredith's family and friends, the legal resolution brought little comfort. Her parents, Dave and Susan Emerson, became advocates for crime victim rights and hiking safety. They worked to pass legislation preventing the release of crime scene photos, sparing other families from having their loved ones' final moments become public spectacle. The Meredith Emerson case revealed how predators like Gary Hilton could use the wilderness as their hunting ground. National forests and parks had always been seen as places of refuge and natural beauty, but Hilton had turned them into something sinister. His victims were people who loved the outdoors, who sought peace and exercise and connection with nature, and he had taken that innocence away from them forever. Blood on New York Trail. The morning air was sharp and clean when a hiker stepped onto the Chautauqua Rails to Trails on September 26, 2021. The converted railroad bed cut through the dense woods of Portland, New York, offering walkers and cyclists a peaceful escape from the world. But that Sunday morning, the trail would reveal something that had been hidden in the earth for years. Just off the main path, partially buried under layers of fallen leaves, the hikers spotted something that made their blood run cold. A human skull. The discovery set off a chain reaction that would expose not one but 2 brutal murders, separated by nearly 2 decades, but connected by the same killer. What investigators didn't know that September morning was that they had stumbled onto the dumping ground of a predator who had been operating in western New York for years. The skull belonged to Cassandra Watson, a woman who had vanished from Buffalo sometime between 2003 and 2004. Watson was around 40 years old when she disappeared, but her case had never gained much attention. She lived on society's margins, and when she stopped coming around, few people noticed or reported her missing. Her skeletal remains had been lying in those woods for nearly 20 years, waiting for someone to find them. Detective work began immediately. The Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office cordoned off the area and called in forensic experts. Crime scene investigators carefully excavated the burial site, documenting every bone fragment and piece of evidence. What they found next shocked even seasoned investigators. Just 10 yards away from Watson's remains, they discovered a second grave. The second victim was fresher, her body having been in the ground for only a few months. This was Marquita Mull, a 50-year-old Buffalo woman who had been reported missing by her family in June 2021. Unlike Watson, Mull's disappearance had been noticed. Her sister Wendy had filed a missing person report when Marquita failed to pick up her disability check. Marquita had been struggling with mental health and physical problems after being hit by a car years earlier, but she was loved and missed. The investigation took on new urgency. Investigators from multiple agencies, the Buffalo Police Department, New York State Police, and the Erie County Crime Analysis Center pooled their resources. The key breakthrough came when forensic experts were able to establish that both victims had connections to the same man, Richard J. Fox, a 61-year-old Buffalo resident with a dark history. Fox was already known to law enforcement as a Level 3 registered sex offender, the highest and most dangerous classification. His criminal record painted a picture of escalating violence against women. In 1993, he'd been convicted of third-degree rape of a 14-year-old girl in Chautauqua County. In 2005, he was convicted of attempted rape and aggravated sexual abuse of a 42-year-old Buffalo woman. The crime showed a pattern. Fox targeted vulnerable women and used violence to control them. The detective work revealed that Fox had lived with Cassandra Watson in Buffalo in the early 2000s. Investigators theorized that Fox had killed Watson sometime between 2003 and 2004, then buried her body in the remote woods of Chautauqua County. The location was carefully chosen, isolated enough that the remains might never be found, yet accessible by car for someone who knew the area. The connection between Fox and Marquita Mull was less clear, but investigators believe Fox targeted her because of her vulnerability. Mull was disabled and isolated, making her an easy victim for someone with Fox's predatory instincts. In June 2021, Fox allegedly killed Mull in Buffalo, then drove her body to the same burial ground where he had hidden Watson's remains nearly 2 decades earlier. Evidence continued to mount against Fox. DNA analysis conducted by Othram Labs confirmed the identities of both victims. The Applied Forensic Science Department at Mercyhurst University assisted with the complex forensic anthropology work needed to examine Watson's skeletal remains. Investigators also discovered that Fox had failed to register as a sex offender as required by law, adding additional charges to his growing list of crimes. In January 2025, Fox was arrested at his Niagara Falls residence and charged with second-degree murder in Mull's death. 2 months later, as investigators continued their painstaking work, Fox was indicted for Watson's murder as well. The charges carried serious consequences. If convicted, Fox faces a maximum sentence of 50 years to life in prison. The arrests brought some measure of closure to the families, but also raised troubling questions about how many other victims Fox might have claimed. Investigators began looking at cold cases throughout western New York, searching for connections to other missing women. The remote location where Fox buried his victims suggested this was not random. He had chosen this spot deliberately, perhaps using it multiple times over the years. The ongoing investigation has revealed the devastating impact of Fox's crimes on the families left behind. Wendy Mull has become an advocate for missing persons cases, working with groups like WNY Missing and Unidentified Persons to keep attention focused on unsolved cases. She visits the site where her sister's body was found each year, marking the anniversary and pushing for justice. For the hiking community that uses the rails to trails, the discovery has cast a shadow over what was once considered a safe and peaceful place. The trail that had been converted from an old railroad bed into a recreational pathway had become, for Fox, a convenient route to dispose of evidence. The irony was not lost on investigators. A path meant to bring people joy and exercise had been used by a killer to hide his crimes. The cave suicide. The phone call came in at dawn on August 20th, 2010. A pickup truck sitting alone in the parking lot of Vortex Spring, Florida, its windows still rolled down from the humid night before. The keys were missing. The owner was nowhere to be found. Inside the truck, investigators would discover something that made their stomachs turn. Detailed maps of the underwater cave system beneath the spring, marked with routes and depths that only an experienced cave diver should attempt. Ben McDaniel had been missing for 2 days. The 30-year-old scuba diver from Memphis had last been seen on the evening of August 18th, descending alone into the cave system that plunged 115 feet beneath the clear waters of Vortex Spring. 2 employees at the dive shop watched him enter the restricted area, a place marked with signs warning of death for unauthorized divers. They never saw him come back up. Detective Chuck Flint arrived at the scene that morning to find a mystery that would consume investigators for years. Ben's diving equipment was scattered around the spring's edge. His tanks were empty. His gear bag remained open, as if he had been preparing for another dive. But Ben himself had vanished without a trace into the dark passages below. The first question investigators asked was simple. Who was Ben McDaniel, and what brought him to this remote diving spot in rural Florida? The answer revealed a man whose life had been unraveling for months. Ben's younger brother had died of the drug overdose just a year earlier. His marriage had collapsed. His construction business had failed, leaving him deep in debt. He'd been living in his parents' beach house, spending his days diving obsessively at various springs throughout the region. Friends told investigators that Ben had become increasingly reckless in the water. He would dive alone, ignoring safety protocols that even experienced divers followed religiously. He talked about pushing deeper into caves than his training allowed. Most troubling of all, he had been diving at Vortex Spring repeatedly despite lacking the specialized certification required for cave diving. The cave beneath Vortex Spring is not a place for casual exploration. Beyond the main basin, the system narrows into passages so tight that divers must remove their tanks to squeeze through. The water turns black. Visibility drops to 0. One wrong turn can mean death, and even certified cave divers have died in less challenging environments. Detective Flint began interviewing the dive shop employees who had seen Ben that final evening. Their stories painted a picture of a man who seemed determined to push his limits. Ben had spent hours studying the cave entrance, measuring distances with his eyes. He'd refilled his tanks multiple times, as if planning an extended dive. When asked about his certification, he'd been evasive. The most disturbing detail came from one employee who had accompanied Ben on his final dive. They had descended together to the cave entrance, past the Grim Reaper warning sign that depicted a skeleton in diving gear. At the gate that blocked unauthorized access to the deeper passages, Ben had done something that shocked his companion. He squeezed underneath the metal barrier and disappeared into the blackness beyond. Search teams arrived within hours of Ben being reported missing. Professional cave divers, including legendary cave rescue specialist Ed Sorensen, made multiple attempts to locate Ben's body. Sorensen himself made 3 separate dives, covering over 1,700 feet of the cave system. He found nothing. No body, no equipment, no signs of struggle or accident. The absence of evidence became evidence itself. How does a man simply vanish in a cave system that experts had thoroughly mapped? The cave at Vortex Spring was well explored, with no hidden chambers or unknown passages. If Ben had died inside, his body should have been found. If he had drowned, it should have surfaced. Ben's parents, Shelby and Patty McDaniel, refused to accept that their son was gone without proof. They hired private investigators, offered rewards, and funded additional searches. The reward money eventually reached $30,000, attracting dozens of divers willing to risk their lives exploring the cave system. In March 2012, one volunteer diver died during a search attempt, forcing the family to confront the possibility that their quest for answers was claiming additional lives. The private investigation revealed disturbing information about some dive shop employees. Several had criminal records. The shop's owner was facing assault and kidnapping charges. Theories began emerging that Ben might have been the victim of foul play, his disappearance staged to cover up a crime. Some investigators suggested that Ben's body had been moved from the cave and hidden elsewhere. But another theory emerged from those who knew Ben best. Friends described a man spiraling into depression, consumed by guilt over his brother's death and his own failures. His obsession with cave diving, they suggested, might have been something darker than thrill-seeking. The cave represented a place where Ben could disappear completely, where his problems would end, where his family would never have to know the truth about what he'd chosen. The forensic evidence supported multiple interpretations. Ben's empty tanks could indicate he had died in the cave from equipment failure. They could also suggest he had surfaced elsewhere and abandoned his gear. The maps in his truck could represent careful planning for a difficult dive, or they could be evidence of premeditation for something more permanent. Investigators found themselves chasing shadows through the clear waters of Vortex Spring. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. Every theory crumbled when tested against the physical evidence. The case files grew thick with interviews, dive reports, and forensic analyses that led nowhere. Today, more than a decade later, Ben McDaniel remains missing. Florida issued a death certificate in 2013, but his parents continue searching for answers. The cave at Vortex Spring has been explored dozens of additional times by teams hoping to solve the mystery. Advanced underwater cameras have mapped every passage. Metal detectors have swept the cave floor. Nothing has been found. The question that haunts investigators is not just what happened to Ben McDaniel, but how a man can disappear so completely that not even advanced forensic science can determine his fate. Missing in the presidential range. The phone call Charlie Farhoody never wanted to get came on the evening of February 15, 2015. His wife Kate wasn't where she was supposed to be. The 32-year-old investment banker from New York City should have been back to their hotel by now, should have been calling to tell him about her solo traverse of the northern presidential range. Instead, she was somewhere out there in the worst winter storm to hit New Hampshire in years. Kate Matrosova had grown up in the frozen landscapes of southern Siberia, where temperatures regularly dropped far below zero and the wind could strip the warmth from your body in minutes. Maybe that's why she felt so comfortable in places that would terrify most people. She had moved to New York as an adult, working her way up to become a derivatives trader at BNP Paribas, but her heart belonged to the mountains. She'd climbed in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. She'd summited Denali and Kilimanjaro. The presidential range was supposed to be just another challenge, another chance to test herself against the elements. Charlie had dropped her off at the Appalachian parking lot at 5 in the morning. The weather forecast was brutal, calling for winds up to 100 miles per hour and wind chills reaching minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Any reasonable person would have turned around and gone back to bed. But Kate wasn't most people. She kissed her husband goodbye, shouldered her pack, and headed into the darkness. Her plan was ambitious. She intended to hike alone across the northern presidential range, summiting Mount Madison, Mount Adams, Mount Jefferson, and Mount Washington before descending to Route 302 where Charlie would pick her up. It was a traverse that experienced hikers would find challenging in perfect summer weather. In the middle of February, with a storm bearing down on the mountains, it bordered on suicidal. Kate's friends and family had grown accustomed to her pushing boundaries. She was a former competitive judoka who approached mountains the same way she approached everything else in her life, with intensity and precision. She studied maps, checked gear, and calculated risks. She believed that proper preparation could overcome any obstacle, but preparation only goes so far when you're alone on a mountain and the weather turns deadly. By midday, Kate had reached the summit of Mount Madison. The wind was howling and the temperature was dropping fast. She should have turned back then. She should have recognized that the conditions were beyond what any solo hiker could handle safely. But Kate pressed on toward Mount Adams, the second peak on her planned route. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, something went wrong. Kate activated her personal locator beacon, sending a distress signal that would trigger a massive search and rescue operation. The signal told rescuers that she was in trouble, but it couldn't tell them what kind of trouble or how much time they had to find her. The Mountain Rescue Service received the alert at 4:58 p.m. Within minutes, rescue teams were mobilizing, but they faced the same brutal conditions that had trapped Kate. Wind gusts were reaching 125 miles per hour, and the wind chill had dropped to minus 65 degrees. Visibility was near zero, and the risk of rescuers becoming victims themselves was extremely high. Charlie waited by his phone in the hotel, hoping for news. He had watched Kate prepare for countless climbs, had seen her come back exhausted but exhilarated from mountains around the world. He knew she was strong and experienced. He told himself that she would find shelter, that she would wait out the storm, that the rescue teams would find her in time. The first search team fought their way up the mountain that evening but was forced to turn back when the conditions became too dangerous. They had come within a mile of Kate's location, but the hurricane-force winds and blowing snow made it impossible to continue safely. The team leader made the difficult decision to wait until morning, when the storm was forecast to weaken slightly. Kate's mother called Charlie from New York asking if he had heard anything. Kate's climbing partners reached out on social media, sharing the rescue operation and hoping for good news. The climbing community was tight-knit, and word of Kate's situation spread quickly through online forums and messaging groups. Everyone who knew her was praying that her experience and determination would keep her alive until help could arrive. On Monday morning, February 16th, search teams headed back up the mountain at first light. The storm had weakened overnight, but conditions were still brutal. The Androscoggin Valley Search and Rescue Team joined the Mountain Rescue Service, along with New Hampshire Fish and Game Conservation officers. They spread out across the terrain where Kate's beacon signal had originated, calling her name and looking for any sign of her presence. Rick Wilcox, who led the Mountain Rescue Service, had been conducting searches in these mountains for decades. He'd seen how quickly conditions could change, how even the most experienced hikers could find themselves in trouble. But he had also seen people survive incredible ordeals through determination and proper preparation. He held on to hope that Kate would be one of the survivors. The searchers found Kate's body near Star Lake between Mount Madison and Mount Adams. She was curled up in a small depression in the snow, wearing all the layers she had brought with her. The medical examiner would later determine that she'd died of exposure, that the extreme cold and wind had overcome her body's ability to generate heat. She'd been less than 2 miles from the Madison Spring Hut, where she could have found shelter, but the whiteout conditions had made navigation impossible. The news of Kate's death hit her husband hard. Charlie had to call her mother in New York, had to tell her family and friends that she wasn't coming home. The woman who had climbed some of the world's highest peaks had been defeated by a mountain she could drive to from Boston. It didn't make sense, and it would never make sense. The rescue teams that recovered Kate's body were experienced professionals, but finding her affected them deeply. These were people who had dedicated their lives to bringing lost hikers home safely, and every failure felt personal. They gathered at the base of the mountain afterward, sharing their grief and trying to understand what had gone wrong. The climbing community began asking difficult questions about Kate's decision to attempt the traverse alone in such conditions. Some criticized her judgment, saying she had been reckless and foolish. Others defended her right to take risks, pointing out that alpinism had always involved pushing boundaries and accepting danger. The debate would continue for years, but it wouldn't bring Kate back. The investigation into Kate's death revealed that she had been carrying proper winter gear and had experience with extreme conditions. She hadn't been unprepared or careless. She had simply encountered weather conditions that exceeded her ability to survive, even with all her skills and equipment. Sometimes, the mountains win, no matter how ready you think you are. The shelter stalker. The security cameras at the homeless shelter captured him every night for weeks, lurking just outside the entrance, studying the faces of women who came seeking safety. He would wait in the shadows near the doorway, sometimes sitting on a nearby bench, always watching. Staff members noticed him but thought he was just another person seeking help who wasn't quite ready to ask for it. They had no idea they were watching a predator selecting his next victims. Across North America, a disturbing pattern has emerged in recent years. Homeless shelters and the vulnerable populations they serve have become hunting grounds for serial killers who understand that society's most vulnerable citizens make the perfect victims. They know these women are isolated, often battling addiction or mental illness, and frequently forgotten by families who have given up trying to help them. When they disappear, it can be days or weeks before anyone reports them missing. In Winnipeg, Jeremy Skibicki proved just how deadly this combination could be. The 34-year-old man spent months studying the routines at homeless shelters throughout the city, learning when women would be alone and vulnerable. During his trial, investigators revealed that Skibicki had told a shelter worker he was there specifically to stalk victims. He wasn't hiding his intentions. He was openly discussing his plans with the very people meant to protect these women. Between March and May of 2022, Skibicki murdered 4 First Nations women, all of whom had connections to Winnipeg's shelter system. Rebecca Comtois was 24 years old and the mother of a young daughter. Her partial remains were found in a garbage bin behind an apartment building, with more bones discovered at the city-run landfill. Morgan Harris, 39, was a mother of 5 and grandmother of 1. Mercedes Moran, 26, was also a mother of 2. The 4th victim couldn't be identified and was given the ceremonial name Mashkode Bijiki Ekwe, which means Buffalo Woman, by Indigenous elders who wanted to ensure she was remembered and honoured. What made the Winnipeg case particularly chilling was how Skibicki operated. Court testimony revealed that he would visit multiple shelters not to seek services, but to observe and select victims. He studied their patterns, when they arrived, when they left, whether they travelled alone. He learned their faces and their names. One shelter worker testified that Skibicki had been completely open about his intentions, telling him directly that he was there to stalk women. The investigation into Skibicki's crimes revealed a sophisticated predator who understood the system designed to help vulnerable people. He knew that women staying in shelters often had chaotic schedules, moving between different facilities or sleeping rough when beds weren't available. He understood that many struggled with addictions that made them easier targets. Most importantly, he recognized that these women existed on society's margins, where disappearances might not be noticed or investigated as thoroughly as they should be. DNA evidence would eventually become crucial to the case. When investigators searched Skibicki's apartment after his arrest, they discovered genetic material from not just his 4 confirmed victims, but from 12 additional women. Some of these women were still alive, but others, including Ashley Shingoose, who went missing in 2022, remained unaccounted for. The discovery raised terrifying questions about the true scope of Skibicki's crimes. The Winnipeg case mirrors a broader pattern that has emerged in cities across North America. In Los Angeles, investigators have tracked multiple serial killers who specifically target homeless populations. Between 2019 and 2023, several different perpetrators were arrested for systematically hunting homeless individuals, understanding that these victims often lack the social connections that would lead to immediate missing person reports. One of the most disturbing aspects of these shelter stalker cases is how long the killers are able to operate before being caught. Skibicki's killing spree lasted for months, and investigators believe he may have been observing and planning for even longer. In Oregon, Anthony Montwheeler was released from state psychiatric supervision in 2016, despite warnings from doctors that he remained dangerous. 4 weeks after his release, prosecutors allege he killed 2 people. The pattern repeats itself. Killers who understand that targeting society's most vulnerable provides them with both easy victims and minimal initial investigation. The investigation techniques used in these cases often rely heavily on surveillance footage and DNA evidence. In the Skibicki case, security cameras at various shelters provided crucial evidence about his stalking behavior. Cell phone tracking data helped investigators piece together his movements on the nights when victims disappeared. But the most powerful evidence came from forensic analysis of his apartment, where investigators found what amounted to a trophy collection of DNA from multiple victims. Detectives working these cases describe a particularly challenging investigation environment. Unlike typical homicide cases where victims have established routines and known associates, homeless victims often move between different social services, making it difficult to establish timelines or identify witnesses. Many of these women used substances that affected their judgment and made them more vulnerable to predation. Some had been estranged from family members for years, meaning their disappearances weren't immediately reported. The psychological profile of shelter stalkers shows perpetrators who specifically seek out vulnerable victims. They often spend considerable time researching their targets, learning about shelter schedules, staff routines, and security measures. They understand that homeless shelters are designed to be accessible and welcoming, which creates opportunities for predators who appear to be seeking help themselves. In the Skibicki case, the killer's method of disposal added another layer of horror to his crimes. He placed victims' remains in garbage bins and construction dumpsters, knowing they would end up in city landfills. This method of disposal reflects the killer's view of his victims as disposable, while also creating enormous challenges for investigators trying to recover evidence. The search for remains in Winnipeg's landfills became a massive undertaking involving specialized equipment and teams of investigators working in hazardous conditions. The landfill searches highlighted the particular cruelty of crimes against homeless individuals. Even in death, these victims faced additional indignities as investigators had to literally search through garbage to find their remains. Police departments across North America have begun developing new protocols for investigating crimes against homeless populations. These include improved communication between law enforcement and social service agencies, better training for officers on the specific vulnerabilities of homeless individuals, and enhanced surveillance at shelters and service locations. The Skibicki case also exposed gaps in how homeless shelters screen individuals seeking services. While shelters must remain accessible to those in genuine need, the case raised questions about whether additional security measures could help identify individuals who are using shelter access for predatory purposes. For the families of victims, these cases carry additional trauma beyond the loss of their loved ones. Many describe feeling that society didn't value their daughters, sisters, or mothers because of their homeless status. The fact that these women were specifically targeted because of their vulnerability adds another layer of injustice to their deaths. The investigation continues in Winnipeg as police work to identify the additional women whose DNA was found in Skibicki's apartment. Each piece of genetic evidence represents another potential victim, another family that may finally get answers about what happened to their missing loved one, vanished without a trace. There's nothing left but empty air where there used to be. No footprints in the dirt, no forgotten wallet on the ground, no torn piece of clothing caught on a branch. They simply stepped from one moment into the next and ceased to exist in our world. Security cameras capture them entering but never leaving. Phone calls end mid-sentence with no explanation. Cars sit abandoned with keys still in the ignition and personal belongings untouched inside. These are the cases that haunt investigators the most, where every lead dissolves like morning mist and every theory crumbles under scrutiny. Brian Schaffer walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloon in Columbus, Ohio on the night of March 31, 2006 and never walked back out. The 27-year-old medical student had been celebrating the start of spring break with friends, moving between bars in the South Campus Gateway area near Ohio State University. Security cameras caught him entering the establishment at 1:15 a.m., talking and laughing with two women by the entrance around 1:55 a.m. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., he walked out of camera heel range and vanished completely. What makes Brian's disappearance so baffling is that the Ugly Tuna Saloon sits on the second floor of a building with only one public exit. Every person who entered had to leave through the same doorway, which was monitored by security cameras all night long. Police reviewed hours of footage showing dozens of patrons leaving the bar throughout the evening, but Brian Schaffer never appeared in any of the exit recordings. It was as if he'd stepped through a portal into another dimension. The investigation revealed that Brian had suffered a devastating loss just weeks before his disappearance. His mother had died of a rare bone marrow disorder in March 2006, leaving him emotionally shattered. Friends described him as struggling with grief while trying to maintain his demanding medical school schedule. On that final night, witnesses said he seemed to be drinking heavily and appeared distressed about recent personal problems. But grief doesn't explain how someone disappears from a building with one exit while security cameras roll. Police searched every inch of the South Campus Gateway complex, including storage areas, maintenance rooms, and even the roof. They found nothing. Investigators theorized that Brian might have used a service exit, or somehow avoided the camera's view, but extensive searches of the building's blueprints showed no viable alternative routes. 1,500 miles away in New Hampshire, another impossible disappearance had occurred 2 years earlier that followed a similar pattern of complete vanishing. On February 9, 2004, 21-year-old Maura Murray crashed her car on Route 112 in the rural town of Woodsville. A local resident saw her standing by the damaged vehicle and offered to call police. Maura declined help, saying she had already contacted AAA. When officers arrived approximately 7 minutes later, they found her car with the driver's door ajar and her personal belongings scattered inside, but Maura was gone. The scene made no logical sense. Route 112 ran through heavily forested terrain with deep snow on the ground in February. Maura was wearing jeans and a light jacket, completely unprepared for a winter night in the New Hampshire wilderness. Search dogs tracked her scent about 100 yards from the crash site, then lost it completely at the middle of the roadway, as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. Maura had withdrawn almost all her money from her bank account earlier that day and packed her dorm room at the University of Massachusetts as if she wasn't planning to return. She had emailed her professors claiming there was a death in the family, though no such emergency existed. Her behaviour suggested careful planning for some kind of departure, but her disappearance after the crash appeared completely spontaneous and impossible to survive in those conditions. A similar pattern of careful planning followed by inexplicable vanishing occurred in Marshall, Minnesota on May 14, 2008. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson had been driving home from a party when his car slid into a ditch on a rural gravel road. He called his father around 1:54 a.m, explaining he was stuck but uninjured. Brandon said he could see lights from the town of Lind and would walk toward them while staying on the phone to guide his parents to his location. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon maintained continuous contact with his father, describing his route and discussing what he could see around him. Then, at 2:30 a.m, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" and the line went dead. His father immediately called back, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Brandon Swanson had vanished while in the middle of a phone conversation, leaving no trace despite massive ground and air searches that covered thousands of acres. The investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies in Brandon's final phone call. He claimed to see lights from Lind, but his cell phone pings showed he was actually several miles away in a completely different direction. Search teams found his car exactly where he described it, but in an area where the lights he described would have been impossible to see. His final words, "Oh shit," suggested he'd encountered something unexpected, but the rural location offered no obvious dangers. These cases share unsettling similarities that distinguish them from typical missing person investigations. All three individuals vanished during documented time periods with clear starting and ending points. All disappeared from locations where their movements should have been trackable or visible. All left behind personal belongings and vehicles that provided no clues about their ultimate fate. Law enforcement agencies have struggled with cases where every physical trace simply ends. Traditional investigation methods rely on evidence trails, witness statements, and forensic analysis, but these disappearances offer none of those elements. Security footage ends abruptly, search dogs lose scent trails in impossible locations, and extensive searches reveal nothing useful. The psychological impact on families facing complete disappearances creates a unique form of grief that never resolves. Unlike cases where bodies are eventually found, providing closure and allowing mourning to begin, these vanishings leave relatives suspended between hope and despair. Parents continue to expect phone calls, siblings imagine chance encounters on distant streets, and spouses struggle with legal and emotional complications of having a partner who exists in legal limbo. Modern technology has improved the ability to track people through cell phone data, GPS systems, and increasingly sophisticated surveillance networks. But these historical cases occurred during a time when such technology was less comprehensive, creating gaps where people could still disappear completely. Even today, investigators acknowledge that certain circumstances could still allow someone to vanish without a trace, particularly in remote areas or during carefully planned departures. The cases of Brian Schaffer, Maura Murray, and Brandon Swanson remain officially unsolved, with their files still open despite decades of investigation. Each generated thousands of tips, extensive media coverage, and dedicated groups of amateur investigators who continue searching for answers. None have provided the breakthrough that would finally explain how three young people stepped out of normal existence and into permanent mystery. The family searchers. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with not knowing. It sits in your chest like a weight that never lifts, a question that follows you through every waking moment and haunts your dreams. For families whose loved ones have vanished without a trace, that pain becomes a driving force that transforms ordinary people into detectives, advocates, and relentless searchers who refuse to accept defeat. Chuck Cox learned this lesson on December 6, 2009, when his daughter Susan Powell disappeared from her West Valley City, Utah home. Susan was 28 years old, the mother of two young boys, and married to Josh Powell, a man who had become the only person of interest in her disappearance. By the time police arrived at the Powell home the next day, Josh claimed he'd taken the boys camping in freezing weather at midnight, a story that made no sense to anyone who knew him. From that first day, Chuck understood that if he wanted answers about what happened to his daughter, he would have to find them himself. A retired crash investigator with the Federal Aviation Administration, Chuck had spent his career analysing disasters and determining their causes. He approached Susan's disappearance with the same methodical precision he'd used to investigate plane crashes, but this time the stakes were personal. The early days of the search brought a flood of volunteers and media attention. Search teams combed through the Utah desert. Police investigated Josh's alibi and searched the family home multiple times. But as weeks turned into months without any trace of Susan, the official search efforts began to wind down. That's when Chuck's real work began. He converted his Puyallup, Washington home into a command center for his private investigation. Maps covered the walls, marked with potential search areas along the Interstate 84 corridor between Oregon and Utah. Chuck believed Josh had driven that route to dispose of Susan's body, and he spent countless weekends driving those same highways, stopping at remote areas where someone might hide a body. He carried a metal detector and digging tools, searching ravines and abandoned buildings for any sign of his daughter. The investigation consumed Chuck's life and his marriage. His wife Judy shared his determination to find Susan, but the endless searching took a toll on both of them. They spent their retirement savings on private investigators, search equipment, and travel expenses. Chuck created a website to collect tips from the public and maintain detailed files on every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. In February 2012, the case took a horrific turn when Josh Powell killed his two sons, Charlie and Braden, in a house fire before taking his own life. The boys had been staying with Chuck and Judy as part of a custody arrangement, and Chuck had just dropped them off for what was supposed to be a supervised visit with their father. Instead of providing answers about Susan's disappearance, Josh had eliminated the only witnesses who might have known what happened to her. The deaths of his grandsons devastated Chuck, but they also strengthened his resolve to find Susan. Now, he was searching not just for his missing daughter, but for justice for two murdered boys who would never get to grow up. He continued his lonely drives through the desert, following tips that led nowhere and pursuing theories that crumbled under investigation. Across the country in Maple Lake, Minnesota, another father was learning the same painful lessons about searching for a missing child. Brian Guimon's son Josh had vanished from the campus of St. John's University on November 9th, 2002. The 20-year-old political science major had left a party around midnight and simply disappeared, leaving behind his car, his wallet, and a promising future as a law student. Like Chuck Cox, Brian Guimond refused to accept that his son was gone without proof. He organised search parties that covered thousands of acres around the university campus. He hired private investigators and consulted with psychics. He studied maps of the area's lakes and rivers, convinced that Josh had somehow fallen into water, despite extensive searches by professional dive teams. The university eventually obtained a restraining order to prevent Brian from conducting searches on campus property, arguing that his constant presence was disruptive to students and staff. But Brian continued his search off campus, following up on reported sightings and investigating every theory, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. Years passed with no answers for either family. Chuck Cox continued his methodical search of the western United States, driving hundreds of thousands of miles and investigating thousands of tips. He appeared on television shows and gave interviews to journalists, always hoping that someone would see Susan's photo and remember something important. He established relationships with other families of missing persons, creating a network of searchers who supported each other through the endless waiting. In 2022, 20 years after Josh Guimond's disappearance, his father Brian received unexpected news. Human remains had been discovered in a Minnesota lake, and authorities were investigating whether they might belong to Josh. DNA testing would eventually rule out the connection, but for a brief moment, Brian allowed himself to hope that his decades of searching might finally provide answers. Chuck Cox faced a similar moment of hope that same year when investigators announced they had found human remains during a search for Susan Powell. Chuck travelled to the scene, convinced that his long search was finally over. But once again, forensic testing revealed that the remains belonged to someone else, leaving Chuck to return home empty-handed and begin searching again. The families of missing persons exist in a unique form of limbo that most people never experience. They can't grieve properly because they don't know for certain that their loved one is dead. They can't move forward because they don't know what happened. They become experts in forensic science, search techniques, and investigative methods not by choice but by necessity. Chuck Cox has now been searching for Susan for more than 14 years. He's in his 70s, but he continues to follow up on tips and investigate new theories. He's outlived Josh Powell and his father Steve, the two men who likely had the most knowledge about Susan's disappearance. But Chuck refuses to give up, driven by the belief that Susan deserves to be found and that his grandsons deserve justice. Brian Guimond has been searching for Josh for over 20 years. He's watched other missing person cases get solved while his son's disappearance remains a mystery. He's seen advances in forensic technology that might help solve cold cases, but none have provided answers about what happened to Josh. These families represent thousands of others across the country who have been transformed by tragedy into amateur investigators and professional searchers. They attend conferences on missing persons investigations, study forensic techniques, and maintain detailed case files that rival those of professional law enforcement agencies. The emotional toll of such prolonged searching is immense. Family relationships strain under the pressure of obsessive investigation. Financial resources are depleted by private investigators and search expenses. Physical health suffers from the stress of constant uncertainty. But for these families, the alternative accepting that their loved one is gone without knowing what happened is unthinkable. Their dedication has led to some remarkable discoveries. Family members have solved cold cases that stumped professional investigators for years. They've uncovered evidence that police missed and identified suspects that law enforcement overlooked. Their refusal to give up has brought closure to other families and justice to victims who might otherwise have been forgotten. But for every success story, there are dozens of families still searching, still hoping, still refusing to accept that their loved one might never be found. They gather at conferences and support groups, sharing information and encouraging each other to keep looking. They create websites and social media pages to keep their cases in the public eye. They become advocates for better missing person investigation procedures and changes to laws that might help other families avoid their ordeal. Digital age mysteries. The smartphone screen glowed at 2:47 a.m., casting pale light across the empty college dormitory hallway. That final text message, sent to a roommate asking for a phone charger, would become the last digital trace of a missing college student. Within hours, investigators would begin the painstaking process of mapping a digital footprint that stretched across social media platforms, GPS coordinates, and cellular tower pings, searching for clues in the vast electronic trail that modern life leaves behind. Digital forensics specialists now find themselves at the center of missing person investigations, armed with tools that previous generations of detectives could never have imagined. They analyze the last moments captured in a person's phone, examining text messages that were never sent, photos that were never posted, and location data that continues pinging long after the person has vanished. The technology that was supposed to make us safer, more connected, and easier to find has instead created new mysteries as complex as the analog world ever produced. Lauren Spearer's case demonstrates how digital evidence can both illuminate and confuse an investigation. The Indiana University student disappeared in the early morning hours of June 3, 2011, after a night of bar hopping in Bloomington. Security cameras captured fragments of her final hours, showing her stumbling barefoot through the streets, too intoxicated to walk steadily. Her iPhone was never recovered, leaving investigators to piece together her movements through the digital breadcrumbs she left behind. Cell tower records showed Lauren's phone connecting to various towers throughout the night, creating a digital map of her journey through downtown Bloomington. The data revealed she had been at several locations that didn't match witness statements, forcing investigators to reconsider their timeline. Text messages recovered from friends' phones showed conversations that continued well into the night, with Lauren's responses becoming increasingly brief and disjointed as the evening progressed. But the digital trail went cold at 4:15 a.m, when Lauren's phone either died or was destroyed. The sudden silence in the data left investigators with more questions than answers. Had she fallen somewhere beyond the reach of cell towers? Had someone deliberately disabled her phone? The technology that should have made her easier to track had instead marked the exact moment when she vanished from the digital world. Brian Schaffer's disappearance 2 years earlier had revealed similar digital mysteries. The Ohio State medical student was captured on security cameras entering the Ugly Tuna Saloon bar in Columbus on March 31, 2006, but was never seen leaving. His phone records showed normal activity throughout the day, including calls to his girlfriend and text messages to friends about meeting up that evening. But after 10:15 p.m, his digital presence simply stopped. Investigators analysed every pixel of the security footage, looking for signs of Brian leaving the bar through alternate exits or hidden in the crowd. They examined his phone for GPS data, But smartphones in 2006 lacked the sophisticated tracking capabilities that would later become standard. The digital evidence that existed painted a picture of a normal evening that ended in inexplicable silence. Cell tower analysis became crucial in these investigations, but the technology brought its own limitations. Tower pings could place a phone within a general area, but not pinpoint an exact location. Environmental factors like weather, building materials and terrain could affect signal strength and create false impressions about a person's movements. Investigators learned to combine cell tower data with other evidence, using it as one piece of a larger puzzle rather than a definitive answer. Maura Murray's 2004 disappearance predated the smartphone era, but still involved crucial digital evidence. The University of Massachusetts student had used her computer to research directions to Vermont and New Hampshire before vanishing after a car accident in rural New Hampshire. Her AOL account showed searches for lodging in the area, suggesting she had planned her trip in advance. But the digital trail was much thinner than it would be for cases just a few years later. Cell phone records from that era provided basic location data through tower connections, but without the GPS coordinates that would later become standard. Investigators could see that Maura's phone had connected to certain towers during her drive north, but they couldn't determine her exact route or the precise location where her phone last made contact with the network. The emergence of social media added new layers of complexity to missing person investigations. Facebook posts, Instagram photos, and Twitter updates created detailed records of people's thoughts, locations, and relationships in the days before they vanished. Investigators began analysing these digital communications for signs of depression, relationship troubles, or threats that might explain a disappearance. But social media also created new opportunities for deception. People could craft online personas that differed dramatically from their real lives, post old photos to create false impressions of their current location, or use scheduling tools to post content after they had already disappeared. The apparent normalcy of a person's social media presence in the days before they vanished could mask underlying turmoil or planning. Digital forensics teams developed specialized tools to extract data from damaged or encrypted devices. They could recover deleted text messages, analyze browsing history, and map location data from multiple sources. But each technological advance seemed to create new challenges as people became more sophisticated about privacy settings, encrypted messaging, and anonymous communication. The analysis of digital evidence required experts who understood both technology and human behavior. A sudden change in texting patterns might indicate distress, but it could also reflect a dead phone battery or loss of service. GPS coordinates that place someone in an unusual location might reveal important information about their final movements, or it might simply show where they dropped their phone. Search and rescue teams began incorporating digital evidence into their field operations. Drone pilots used GPS coordinates from cell towers to focus their aerial searches on specific areas. Ground teams carried devices that could detect the faint electronic signatures of buried phones, hoping to locate victims through their technology rather than traditional search methods. But the digital age also created new forms of evidence that could disappear as quickly as it appeared. Cloud storage meant that crucial data might be stored on servers thousands of miles away, accessible only through complex legal processes. Apps that automatically deleted messages or photos could eliminate evidence before investigators even knew to look for it. Missing person cases from the early 2000s created a stark contrast with those from a decade later. Earlier cases relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence, and traditional detective work. Later cases generated massive amounts of digital data that required teams of analysts to process and interpret. Neither approach guaranteed success, but each offered different insights into the final moments of people who simply vanished. The promise of digital technology to solve missing person cases remains partially unfulfilled. While investigators now have access to unprecedented amounts of data about people's movements and communications, they also face new challenges in processing, analyzing, and interpreting that information. The digital breadcrumbs that every person leaves behind can illuminate their final hours, but they can also create false leads, overwhelming amounts of irrelevant data, and new forms of evidence that require specialized expertise to understand. The weather factor. The thermometer read 28 degrees below zero as Brandon Swanson stepped out of his car on the rural Minnesota road. It was 2 a.m. on May 14, 2008, and the 19-year-old college student had just attended an end-of-semester celebration in Canby. The wind whipped across the flat prairie landscape, cutting through his clothes like a blade. Within minutes, the combination of alcohol in his system and the brutal cold would create conditions that survival experts describe as a deadly equation. As Brandon spoke to his father on his cell phone, his words already showed signs of confusion that hypothermia brings in its earliest stages. Weather conditions had been building throughout that May evening, creating what meteorologists would later describe as an unseasonably cold front that dropped temperatures across southwestern Minnesota to dangerous levels. The National Weather Service had issued frost warnings, but for a young man leaving a party, the focus was on getting home safely, not on survival. Brandon's car had slid into a ditch along a gravel road, leaving him stranded in an environment where exposed skin could develop frostbite within minutes. During his 47-minute phone conversation with his father, Brandon's speech patterns changed noticeably. Audio analysis would later show his words becoming increasingly slurred, not just from alcohol, but from the cognitive effects of dropping body temperature. He kept insisting he was near the town of Lind, but cell tower records placed him miles away in a different direction. The cold was already affecting his ability to think clearly, a condition that search and rescue experts recognize as one of the first indicators that hypothermia is setting in. At the same time Brandon was struggling against the Minnesota cold, weather patterns across North America were creating similar life-threatening conditions for outdoor enthusiasts. In Washington state, spring storms were building in the Olympic Mountains, where temperatures could drop 40 degrees between day and night. These same weather systems that brought Minnesota its unexpected freeze were part of a larger pattern that made May 2008 particularly dangerous for anyone caught unprepared in the wilderness. Jacob Gray had experienced similar conditions just months earlier during his cycling trip through Olympic National Park. The 22-year-old had planned a solo bike tour through the park's remote interior, but weather reports failed to accurately predict how quickly conditions would deteriorate at higher elevations. Spring in the Olympics is notoriously unpredictable, with sunny morning conditions giving way to freezing rain and snow by afternoon. Gray's bicycle was found near the Solduke River, but his body was never recovered despite extensive searches. The weather data from Jacob's disappearance reveals the brutal efficiency with which hypothermia can overtake even experienced outdoorsmen. Temperatures had dropped from 55 degrees during the day to 32 degrees by evening, with wind gusts reaching 40 miles per hour. The combination of cold, wind and moisture creates what survival experts call the perfect storm for hypothermia, where the human body loses heat faster than it can generate it. Search teams looking for both Brandon and Jacob faced the same weather-related challenges that likely contributed to both disappearances. In Minnesota, searchers dealt with freezing temperatures that made ground searches dangerous for the rescuers themselves. Search dogs lost scent trails in the cold air, and aircraft were grounded due to poor visibility from frost and fog. The very conditions that endangered the missing persons also hampered efforts to find them. Weather records from both searches show how quickly conditions can become unsurvivable. Medical experts calculate that in 28-degree temperatures with wind, an impaired person can lose consciousness from hypothermia within 30 to 60 minutes. Once core body temperature drops below 95 degrees, decision-making becomes severely compromised. Below 90 degrees, most people lose the ability to walk or help themselves. The parallel between these cases extends beyond just cold temperatures. Both Brandon and Jacob were caught in what survival instructors call transitional weather, conditions that appear manageable but can quickly become deadly. Spring evenings in northern climates are particularly deceptive because daytime warmth gives no indication of how rapidly temperatures will fall after sunset. Geraldine Largay's disappearance on the Appalachian Trail in 2013 provides another perspective on how weather becomes a factor in missing person cases. The 66-year-old nurse had been hiking for weeks when she stepped off the trail in western Maine and became disoriented. Weather conditions during her disappearance were actually mild by comparison. Temperatures in the 70s during the day, 50s at night. But survival time decreases dramatically when someone is lost and unable to find shelter or maintain body heat. The journal Geraldine kept during her 26 days of survival shows how weather gradually wore down her strength and hope. Cool nights required her to use her sleeping bag and available clothing to stay warm. but without adequate food and water, her body's ability to generate heat diminished each day. Rain made everything worse, soaking her clothing and shelter, while cool temperatures prevented anything from drying out. Dani Philippidis presents perhaps the strangest weather-related disappearance in recent memory. The Toronto firefighter vanished from Whiteface Mountain in New York during a February 2018 skiing trip, only to surface 6 days later in California with no memory of how he got there. Weather conditions at Whiteface that week were severe, temperatures below zero, wind chills approaching -30, and heavy snow that limited visibility to mere feet. Medical experts who studied Dani's case noted that severe hypothermia can cause memory loss and disorientation that lasts long after body temperature returns to normal. The conditions at Whiteface were extreme enough to cause rapid onset of hypothermia in anyone exposed to them for extended periods. His survival and mysterious journey to California remain unexplained, but weather clearly played a role in whatever happened during those missing days. Weather patterns create what search and rescue teams call survival windows. The amount of time someone can survive in specific conditions before succumbing to exposure. In Brandon Swanson's case, that window was measured in hours due to the extreme cold. For Jacob Gray in the Olympics, changing conditions meant his window shrank rapidly as temperatures dropped and wind increased. Geraldine Largay had a longer survival window due to milder conditions, but inadequate resources eventually led to the same outcome. The timing of weather changes often proves crucial in these disappearances. Brandon vanished during an unexpected cold snap that caught everyone off guard. Jacob's disappearance coincided with a sudden spring storm system. Even in Geraldine's case, what started as ideal hiking weather gradually became a factor as her situation extended from days into weeks. The weather itself becomes both a contributing factor to the initial crisis and a continuing threat that limits survival time and hampers rescue efforts. Predators on the path. The footprints in the mud told a story investigators had seen before, but hoped they would never see again. Fresh boot prints followed the trail for miles, then suddenly veered off the marked path toward the shelter where hikers had been found dead just hours earlier. These weren't the random footprints of a lost hiker wandering in confusion. These tracks showed purpose, deliberate movement, a predator stalking prey along one of America's most beloved hiking destinations. On the morning of May 11, 2019, veteran hiker Ronald Sanchez Jr. was found stabbed to death at a campsite on the Appalachian Trail near Smith County, Virginia. The 43-year-old Army veteran, who had served 3 tours in Iraq, was hiking the trail to cope with post-traumatic stress disorder. Another hiker had been severely wounded in the same attack. Within hours, investigators had identified their suspect, 30-year-old James Jordan, a disturbed drifter who had been terrorizing hikers for days with bizarre threats and erratic behavior. Jordan, who used the trail name Sovereign, had been reported to authorities multiple times in the days leading up to the attack. Fellow hikers described encounters where Jordan would appear suddenly at campsites, talking to himself and making disturbing statements about burning people alive. One witness told investigators that Jordan had threatened to burn down their tents while they slept. Despite these reports, Jordan remained on the trail, free to continue his escalating pattern of intimidation until it turned deadly. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern that law enforcement had documented before on America's hiking trails. Jordan had been moving systematically along the trail, studying other hikers, learning their routines, and identifying vulnerable targets. Security footage from trail access points showed him following groups of hikers, sometimes staying several hundred yards behind them for miles at a time. Cell phone data later confirmed that Jordan had been tracking his victims' movements for days before the attack. Detective work in the Sanchez case immediately brought to mind another predator who had haunted the same trail system decades earlier. In 1981, Randall Smith murdered hikers Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsey at a shelter along Dismal Creek in Virginia. Smith, like Jordan, had been living rough near the trail, observing hikers and planning his attacks. The investigation into those murders revealed that Smith had been visiting the shelter regularly, sometimes helping other hikers with small tasks while secretly studying their equipment and travel plans. The parallels between the cases were unmistakable to investigators. Both killers used the remote nature of trail shelters to their advantage, knowing that victims would be isolated and that help would be hours away. Both had been reported for suspicious behavior before their attacks, but the informal nature of trail communication meant these warnings often didn't reach the right authorities in time. Most significantly, both killers understood that the hiking community's culture of trust and openness made their victims particularly vulnerable. When Smith was arrested in 1981, investigators found journals detailing his observations of various hikers, including notes about their equipment, travel schedules, and perceived weaknesses. The forensic evidence that convicted him included fingerprints found on a book belonging to victim Susan Ramsey. But it was the psychological profile that emerged during the investigation that proved most disturbing. Smith had been systematically studying the trail system for months, learning the locations of the most isolated shelters and the times when they were least likely to be visited by other hikers. The investigation techniques used in both cases highlight the unique challenges of solving crimes in wilderness areas. Traditional forensic evidence like DNA and fingerprints can be degraded by weather and environmental factors. Witness identification becomes crucial, but the transient nature of hiking means witnesses may have moved on to other states by the time investigators need to interview them. Cell phone coverage is often spotty or non-existent, making it difficult to establish timelines or track suspect movements. In the Gary Hilton case, investigators faced similar challenges when the 61-year-old survivalist began targeting hikers across multiple national forests in Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida between 2007 and 2008. Hilton had spent years perfecting his knowledge of remote hiking areas, learning which trails were least patrolled and which times of year saw the fewest visitors. When he killed 24-year-old Meredith Emerson on Blood Mountain in Georgia, investigators discovered that Hilton had been photographing and following hiking groups for months. The forensic breakthrough in the Hilton case came from an unexpected source. Security cameras at a convenience store near the hiking area captured Hilton's vehicle on the day of Emerson's disappearance. More importantly, investigators found that Hilton had been using the store's bathroom to clean up after attacks, leaving behind crucial DNA evidence. The investigation revealed that Hilton had been treating national forest areas like his personal hunting preserve, driving hundreds of miles between different trail systems to find victims. The psychological profiling of trail predators shows killers who specifically seek out the isolation and vulnerability that hiking areas provide. Unlike urban serial killers who often target sex workers or other marginalized populations, trail predators prey on healthy, active individuals who have voluntarily placed themselves in remote areas. The killers understand that hikers often travel alone or in small groups, carry valuable equipment, and may not be missed for days or weeks. Advanced investigative techniques have become crucial in solving these cases. GPS tracking data from victims' devices can help establish timelines and movement patterns. Trail cameras installed by wildlife agencies sometimes capture images of suspects. Social media posts by hikers can provide investigators with real-time information about suspicious individuals on the trail. In the Jordan case, posts on hiking forums had been warning about his threatening behavior for days before the attack. The investigation into Randall Smith took an even more disturbing turn in 2008, when he attacked two more hikers near the same area where he had committed murder 27 years earlier. Smith had been released from prison in 1996 after serving just 15 years for the double homicide. When he attacked Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer, investigators quickly connected the incident to Smith's previous crimes through ballistic evidence and witness descriptions. The forensic evidence in trail murder cases often requires specialized collection techniques. Blood evidence may be scattered across wide areas and contaminated by rain or animal activity. Footprint evidence in soft soil can provide crucial tracking information, but must be cast quickly before weather destroys it. The remote locations mean crime scene investigators often have to hike for hours carrying heavy equipment to process evidence properly. The false leads, every investigation has them. Those maddening tips that seem promising at first, then lead search teams down rabbit holes that waste precious time and resources. On the Appalachian Trail, where missing hikers can mean life or death scenarios, false leads don't just delay justice, they can cost lives. The pattern repeats itself across decades of cases. A well-meaning witness thinks they saw something. A hiker remembers a conversation that seemed odd. A piece of evidence appears significant until it isn't. And suddenly hundreds of search personnel are combing through the wrong area while the clock keeps ticking. When Geraldine Largay disappeared from the Appalachian Trail in Maine in July 2013, the false leads began almost immediately. The 66-year-old retired nurse, known by her trail name Inchworm, had been hiking with her husband George when she stepped off the trail for what should have been a quick bathroom break. She never returned. Within hours of her disappearance, tips started pouring in. Hikers called to report seeing a woman matching Largay's description, walking alone near different shelters. Others claimed they'd spotted someone who looked like her hitchhiking along nearby roads. Each report seemed credible enough to investigate. Search teams fanned out across Maine's wilderness, following these leads with methodical precision. They interviewed the witnesses, searched the reported locations, and documented every detail. But as days turned into weeks, a troubling pattern emerged. None of the sightings checked out. The woman at the shelter turned out to be another hiker entirely. The hitchhiker was a local resident. The trail conversations were misremembered or confused with other encounters. The most damaging false lead came from a cell phone ping. Largay had managed to send a text message to her husband, saying she was off the trail and couldn't find her way back. The cellular tower data suggested her location, and search teams concentrated their efforts in that area. They spent days searching terrain that seemed logical based on the technology. What they didn't know was that the ping location was misleading them by miles. Meanwhile, Largay was slowly dying just 2 miles from the trail in a completely different direction. She had built a small shelter and tried to signal for help, but the search teams were looking in all the wrong places. For 26 days, she survived on minimal supplies, writing desperate journal entries asking anyone who found her body to contact her husband. The searchers never came close to her actual location. The false leads in the Largay case weren't malicious. They came from people trying to help, from technology that seemed reliable, and from reasonable assumptions about where a lost hiker might go, but they diverted resources from the systematic grid search that might have found her alive. 3 years after the search was called off, 2 surveyors working in the area found Largay's remains in her makeshift shelter. She'd been less than 2 miles from the trail the entire time, in an area that had never been properly searched because all the false leads had pointed elsewhere. The same pattern played out in other cases. When the hiker known as Mostly Harmless was found dead in his tent in Florida, the investigation to identify him was plagued by false leads for over 2 years. People came forward claiming he was their missing brother, their former co-worker, or someone they'd met years earlier. Each lead required investigation, DNA testing when possible, and careful documentation. Online amateur detectives flooded social media with theories about his identity. They matched his photo to missing persons reports from across the country. They analysed his gear, his food choices, and his hiking style for clues. Most of these leads went nowhere, but investigators had to follow them systematically because any one of them could have been the breakthrough they needed. The false identification attempts weren't just time-consuming, they were emotionally devastating for the families involved. People who had lost loved ones would see the photos and feel a surge of hope, only to have DNA tests dash those hopes weeks later. The process repeated dozens of times before the hiker was finally identified as Vance Rodriguez through a college roommate's recognition. In the unsolved murder of Scott Lilly in Virginia, false leads have kept the case open but unsolved for over a decade. The 30-year-old man was found strangled near the Cow Camp Gap shelter in 2011, and immediately tips began flowing to investigators. People reported seeing suspicious individuals in the area. Hikers remembered strange encounters. Local residents called in reports of unusual activity. Each lead required investigation by the Joint Task Force of FBI, National Park Service, and Virginia State Police. They interviewed witnesses, tested DNA evidence, and followed paper trails that seemed promising. But none of the leads panned out. The killer remained unidentified, and the case grew cold despite hundreds of hours of investigative work chasing false information. The problem with false leads isn't just that they waste time and resources, it's that they create a false sense of progress. Search coordinators and investigators feel like they're making headway when they're actually spinning their wheels. Meanwhile, the real evidence might be sitting unnoticed because everyone is focused on the wrong information. Technology has made the false lead problem both better and worse. GPS devices and cell phone data can provide accurate location information, but they can also mislead if the technology fails or is misunderstood. social media allows information to spread quickly, but it also amplifies false sightings and mistaken identifications. The human element remains the most challenging aspect. Witnesses genuinely want to help, but memory is unreliable. People see what they expect to see, remember conversations that might have happened differently, and fill in details that weren't actually there. A hiker who seemed nervous might have just been tired. A person walking alone might have been perfectly safe, just enjoying solitude. Investigation protocols now try to account for the false lead phenomenon. Search coordinators rank tips by credibility and assign resources accordingly. DNA testing can quickly eliminate false identifications, but the fundamental problem remains. In missing person cases, investigators can't afford to ignore any potential lead, even when experience tells them that most won't pan out. For the families of missing hikers, false leads represent both hope and torture. Each new tip might be the one that brings their loved one home, but each dead end deepens their anguish. They watch search teams follow lead after lead, never knowing which one might be real until it's proven false. The trail community itself sometimes contributes to the false lead problem. Hikers want to help when someone goes missing, so they report every unusual encounter or conversation they remember. Trail angels and hostel owners share information about people they've met. Most of this information is useless, but buried within it might be the crucial detail that solves the case. For over 50 years, the Appalachian Trail has been a place where people disappear, some by choice, some by accident, and some by the hands of others who prey on those seeking solitude in the wilderness. The families still search, the investigators still follow leads, and the trail keeps its secrets. The Appalachian Trail continues to call to adventurers from around the world, but now you know the stories it doesn't want to tell, the hikers who started their journey but never finished it, the families who are still waiting for answers, and somewhere along those 2,190 miles, more secrets are waiting to be discovered.